Good evening, and welcome back to Almighty Sleep. There was once a knight so feared that French mothers were said to invoke his name to quiet restless children, and so honoured by his enemies that a captured king dined at his table as an honoured guest rather than a prisoner in chains. He wore black armour into battles he had no right to survive, and he survived them anyway, again and again, until illness succeeded where French knights could not. So before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And if you're listening tonight, tell me where you're tuning in from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Now dim the lights, maybe let a fan hum somewhere in the background, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. A prince is born at Woodstock. In the early summer of 1330, in a royal hunting lodge at Woodstock in Oxfordshire, a child was born who would grow into one of the most celebrated and most controversial warriors of the European Middle Ages. He was christened Edward, the eldest son of King Edward III of England and Queen Philippa of Hainault, and from the moment of his birth on the 15th of June, he carried a weight that few infants ever carry. The expectation of a crown, the expectation of glory, and ultimately the expectation of a legend that would outlive him by nearly 7 centuries. History would come to know him by another name entirely, a name that did not actually appear in writing until long after his death. He would become the Black Prince. Nobody in that birthing chamber at Woodstock called him that. Nobody who watched him take his first breath imagined the nickname that would attach itself to him, debated by historians ever since, some saying it referred to the colour of his armour, others insisting it referred to the darkness of his reputation in France, where his campaigns left burned villages and slaughtered townsfolk in their wake. We will get to all of that. But for now, in the warm hush of an English summer, he was simply Edward, son of Edward, heir to a throne, and heir to a kingdom that was, in the year of his birth, still finding its footing after a turbulent and uncertain decade. To understand the prince, we first have to understand the world he was born into, because nothing about Edward of Woodstock makes sense without the chaos of the English crown in the years just before his birth. His father, Edward III, had become king in highly unusual circumstances. In 1327, when the elder Edward was only 14 years old, his own father, Edward II, had been deposed in a coup engineered largely by the king's wife, Isabella of France, and her lover Roger Mortimer. Edward II's reign had been a catalogue of disasters: military humiliation at the hands of the Scots, court favourites who alienated the nobility, and a kingdom that felt rudderless and embarrassed on the European stage. The teenage Edward III was crowned king in name, but for the first 3 years of his reign real power rested with his mother and Mortimer, who ruled as regents in all but title. It was, by most accounts, an uncomfortable arrangement for a young man who had inherited a throne but not the authority that should have come with it. In October of 1330, just months after his own son's birth at Woodstock, the young Edward III staged what amounted to a palace coup of his own. With a small band of loyal companions, he stormed Nottingham Castle through a secret tunnel, arrested Mortimer, and effectively ended his mother's regency. Mortimer was executed. Isabella was sent into a comfortable but firmly supervised retirement, and Edward III, now 18 years old and the father of an infant son, finally became king in practice as well as in name. This is the world the Black Prince was born into, a father who had just seized control of his own destiny through boldness and daring, who had watched weakness and humiliation nearly destroy the English crown, and who was determined that his reign, and the reign of his heirs, would be defined by strength instead. It is worth pausing here because I think it explains something essential about the household young Edward grew up in. This was not a court that prized caution. It was a court built quite literally around the idea that a young man with courage and a small band of loyal followers could change the course of history through sheer audacity. Edward III had proven it himself at 18. He would spend the rest of his reign trying to prove something larger, that England, long overshadowed by the wealth and prestige of the French crown, deserved to stand as an equal, or better, on the European stage. And his eldest son, born in the hunting lodge in Woodstock, would become the instrument through which much of that ambition was realised. Little Edward's early years were spent largely removed from the political intrigue that had defined his father's youth. Queen Philippa was, by most contemporary accounts, a warm and attentive mother, beloved by the English people for her gentleness, a quality that stood in stark contrast to the steel of her husband, and eventually the battlefield reputation of her son. The royal nursery moved between several residences, Woodstock among them, but increasingly centred on Windsor, which Edward III was beginning to favour and would later rebuild into the spiritual heart of English chivalry. The young prince had siblings arriving in steady succession. Isabella came in 1332, Joan followed in 1333. William, who did not survive infancy, came and went in 1336. Then Lionel in 1338, John of Gaunt in 1340, and Edmund in 1341. The Plantagenet nursery, in other words, was a busy and crowded place, filled with the kind of noise and chaos any large medieval family of small children might generate, royal or otherwise. But even amid that domestic bustle, Edward of Woodstock was different, and everyone around him knew it. He was the eldest. He was, from his earliest years, addressed and treated as the future King of England, and the entire machinery of his upbringing was oriented toward producing a monarch capable of holding together a kingdom that his father intended to expand dramatically. He was given his own household relatively early, as was customary for royal heirs, staffed with tutors, knights, and servants, whose job was not merely to keep him fed and safe, but to begin shaping him, year by year, into the kind of man medieval England believed a king needed to be. That meant instruction in Latin and French, the latter being essentially the native tongue of the English aristocracy at this point in history, a detail that often surprises people today. It meant instruction in religion, in the rituals and obligations of Christian kingship, because medieval rulership was inseparable from the Church's blessing and the careful performance of piety. And increasingly, as he grew past infancy into boyhood, it meant instruction in the skills that would define his entire adult life: horsemanship, swordsmanship, the handling of weapons, the etiquette of the tournament, and the codes of chivalry that, however idealized and however frequently violated in practice, formed the moral language of the aristocratic world he was born to lead. In 1337, when Edward of Woodstock was just 7 years old, his father made a decision that would shape the rest of the prince's life, and indeed shape the next century of European history. King Edward III formally claimed the throne of France. The claim rested on a genealogical technicality. Edward's mother, Isabella, was the daughter of the French King Philip IV, which made Edward III a grandson of a French monarch through the female line. When the direct male line of the Capetian dynasty died out in the late 1320s, French nobles invoked an old legal principle, later formalized as Salic law, to bar succession through women, and the throne passed instead to a cousin, Philip of Valois, who became Philip VI. Edward III, who had initially accepted this outcome, eventually reversed course and declared himself the rightful King of France. Whether this was a sincere belief in his legal claim, or, as most historians now think, primarily a political and diplomatic manoeuvre tied up with disputes over the rich wool-producing region of Gascony, is still debated, but the practical effect was unmistakable. It set England and France on a collision course that would not be resolved within Edward III's lifetime, nor within his son's, nor within several lifetimes after that. It set in motion what history would eventually name, with a kind of grim simplicity, the 100 Years' War. For a 7-year-old prince at Windsor, none of this would have seemed especially urgent in the moment. Wars were declared, threatened, and postponed regularly in medieval diplomacy, and a formal claim to a foreign throne did not necessarily mean armies would march any time soon, but the declaration set the stage for everything that would follow in Edward of Woodstock's life. He would not grow up to be merely a prince attending tournaments and managing estates. He would grow up to be the chief instrument of his father's war, the commander whose victories would, for a time, make England the terror of the French countryside and the envy of every chivalric court in Europe. By the early 1340s, the boy was already being prepared for a public role beyond what most children his age would have known. In 1337, the same year as the French claim, he was created Duke of Cornwall, the first time that particular title had ever been used in England, specifically invented for him as a way of providing the heir to the throne with a substantial independent income and a clear territorial identity separate from the crown itself. It is, incidentally, a title that has remained attached to the heir apparent of the British throne ever since, which is a small but striking thread connecting a 700-year-old prince to the modern royal family. 3 years later, in 1340, he was further elevated. His father granted him various honours and responsibilities meant to begin acclimating him, gradually, to the machinery of governance and the symbolism of royal authority. What strikes me most, looking back at these early years, is how deliberately the entire apparatus of Edward III's court was constructing a particular kind of son. This was not idle parenting. Every step, every title, every tutor assigned, every horse given, every small ceremonial appearance at his father's side was a brick in the foundation of a future king who was meant to embody the martial glory his father craved for England. And the prince, it seems, absorbed these lessons eagerly. Contemporary chroniclers, writing admittedly with the benefit of hindsight and a fair amount of flattery, describe a boy who took naturally to horsemanship, who showed early promise with weapons, who carried himself with a kind of seriousness beyond his years. We should always be a little sceptical of medieval chronicles describing the childhood virtues of princes who went on to become famous, because flattery was something of an occupational hazard for court writers. But even accounting for that bias, the broad pattern of his upbringing is clear enough from the documentary record: the grants of land, the appointments of household officers, the steady accumulation of titles and responsibilities, all of it pointing toward a young man being groomed with extraordinary care for both kingship and, more immediately, for war. By the time he reached his early teenage years, war was no longer a distant abstraction discussed by diplomats in council chambers. It was becoming the defining reality of the age he was growing into. English and French forces clashed intermittently throughout the late 1330s and early 1340s in a series of skirmishes, naval engagements, and diplomatic standoffs, most notably the great naval victory at Slees in 1340, where the English fleet devastated the French navy in a battle so bloody that, according to one possibly apocryphal account, the contemporary French court jester refused to inform King Philip of the defeat, saying only that the English sailors lacked the courage of the French, who, unlike the English, at least had the decency to jump into the sea rather than die fighting. I find that story almost certainly too good to be entirely true, but it captures something real about the scale of the disaster at Slees and the way it humiliated the French crown. By the middle of the decade, the young prince was approaching the age at which medieval noble sons typically began their transition from training to active military service. He had been raised in a household saturated with the language and imagery of chivalry, the romances of King Arthur, the tales of crusading knights, the elaborate codes of honour that governed how a true knight was supposed to behave both on and off the battlefield. He had watched his father stage increasingly grand tournaments, partly for sport, partly as deliberate propaganda meant to project an image of English martial vigour to visiting foreign dignitaries, and he had, by all accounts, absorbed every bit of it, developing into a young man eager, perhaps even desperate, to prove himself in genuine combat, rather than the carefully choreographed violence of the tournament field. He would not have to wait much longer. In the summer of 1346, when Edward of Woodstock was 16 years old, his father assembled one of the largest invasion fleets England had mustered in a generation, and the prince, despite his youth, was given a role in the coming campaign that went far beyond ceremonial accompaniment. What followed would become the defining moment of his early life, the battle that transformed a 16-year-old prince into a legend, whose name would echo through English memory for the rest of the medieval period and well beyond. But before we arrive at the fields near Crecy, we need to spend a little more time understanding exactly how a 16-year-old came to be entrusted with battlefield command in the first place, because it tells us a great deal about both the man Edward of Woodstock was becoming and the unusual military culture of 14th century England. The boy who would be made at Crecy medieval childhood, particularly for the aristocracy, operated on a timeline that can feel almost shockingly accelerated to modern sensibilities. By the standards of the 14th century, a 16-year-old was not really a boy at all in any meaningful social sense. He was very nearly a man, already considered capable of marriage, of managing estates, of bearing arms in earnest. The medieval concept of childhood as a protected, extended phase of life, the way we generally understand it today, simply did not exist in the same form. Noble sons were typically placed into the households of other lords around the age of 7 to begin their formal education in arms and courtesy. By 14, many young nobles were serving as squires in active campaigns, learning the brutal practicalities of warfare not through abstract lessons but through direct, often terrifying exposure to real combat. By 18 or even younger, they might be knighted and given command responsibilities that would seem, by any modern military standard, recklessly premature. Edward of Woodstock followed this trajectory, though with the added weight of being heir to the throne, which meant his training carried implications far beyond his personal development. Everything he learned, every skill he mastered, was understood by the court around him as preparation not just for a future as a soldier, but for an eventual reign as king, a reign in which military leadership would be inseparable from political authority. Medieval kingship was, at its core, a martial institution. A king who could not lead armies, who could not inspire loyalty through demonstrated courage on the battlefield, risked being seen as weak, vulnerable to the same kind of political humiliation that had ultimately destroyed his grandfather, Edward II. Edward III understood this intimately, having lived through his father's catastrophic failures as a war leader, and he was determined that his son would never be vulnerable to the same criticism. So the prince trained. He trained in the use of the sword, the lance, and increasingly, given the direction English military doctrine was taking during this period, in the tactical understanding of how infantry and archers could be combined to devastating effect against heavily armoured cavalry, a lesson English commanders had been absorbing painfully through their long and often frustrating conflicts with the Scots. The Battle of Bannockburn in 1314, where Robert the Bruce had humiliated English forces under Edward II, remained a vivid cautionary memory within English military thinking, a reminder that armoured knights charging without proper coordination and tactical discipline could be slaughtered or routed by determined, well-positioned infantry. Conversely, the Battle of Halidon Hill in 1333, fought during Edward III's own reign, had shown the devastating effectiveness of dismounted men-at-arms combined with long bowmen positioned on defensible ground, a tactical formula that would, within just over a decade, be deployed on a scale and with a level of success that would make it one of the most studied and celebrated battlefield formulas in medieval military history. This is, I think, a detail worth sitting with for a moment, because it is easy when telling stories of medieval knights to imagine warfare as a kind of glorified jousting contest scaled up. Armoured men charging at one another with lances until one side simply gives way. The reality of 14th century English warfare, particularly as it developed under Edward III and was then refined further by his son, was considerably more calculated than that. English commanders of this period were developing and refining a battlefield doctrine that deliberately leaned into discipline, defensive positioning, and the devastating firepower of the longbow, a weapon that, in the hands of a trained archer, could loose arrows with enough force and frequency to punch through plate armour at range and absolutely shred lightly armoured infantry or unprotected horses. The longbow was not a flashy weapon. It required years, sometimes a lifetime, of practice to master. And English law during this period actually required commoners to practice archery regularly, in some cases mandating that other sports be set aside in favour of time spent at the archery butts. It was, in a very real sense, a national weapons programme, decades in the making by the time the prince came of age, and it would prove to be the single most decisive factor in the battle that made his reputation. In July of 1346, King Edward III launched an invasion of Normandy, landing a substantial army at Saint-Vaast-la-Hougue on the Cotentin Peninsula. The campaign that followed was by design brutal. English forces marched across Normandy in what would become a recognisable pattern of warfare throughout the 100 Years' War, a tactic the French called the chevauchée, essentially a large-scale, deliberately destructive raid intended to burn towns, devastate farmland, and humiliate the French crown by demonstrating its inability to protect its own territory. We will spend a great deal more time discussing chevauchée later in this story, because Edward of Woodstock would go on to become arguably the most accomplished and most feared practitioner of this brutal style of warfare in the entire conflict. But this first campaign, in the summer of 1346, was where he received his real introduction to it, riding alongside his father's army as it cut a swath of destruction across some of the richest farmland in France. The young prince, now 16, had been formally knighted shortly after the army landed in Normandy, a customary practice meant to inspire and bind young nobles more closely to the cause through the ceremonial weight of knighthood conferred on the eve of war. He was given nominal command of one of the army's 3 main divisions, though in practice he would have been surrounded by experienced commanders and advisors, men like the Earl of Warwick and Godfrey d'Harcourt, a Norman exile who had defected to the English cause and possessed invaluable local knowledge of the territory the army was traversing. This is an important detail, because it tells us something about how medieval military command actually functioned for young royal heirs. Edward of Woodstock was not simply handed an army and left to figure things out alone. He was placed in a position of nominal authority, surrounded by a council of seasoned veterans whose job was to guide and, when necessary, restrain the impulses of a 16-year-old eager to prove himself. But the title of command was not purely ceremonial either. Decisions made in his name carried real weight, and as the campaign progressed and the army moved deeper into hostile territory, the prince increasingly found himself at the centre of genuine high-stakes military decision-making rather than safely tucked away from danger, the English army marched through Normandy and into the Ile-de-France, coming close enough to Paris itself to throw the French capital into a panic, burning the suburbs of the city and forcing King Philip VI to begin mobilising a massive response. By this point, the English position was, strategically speaking, somewhat precarious. They were deep in enemy territory, far from any reliable line of supply or reinforcement, and the French crown was assembling an army of a size that would, on paper, dwarf the forces under Edward III's command. Most contemporary estimates suggest the French army that eventually gathered numbered somewhere between 20 and 30,000 men, including a substantial contingent of heavily armoured cavalry drawn from the cream of French nobility, alongside thousands of Genoese crossbowmen hired as mercenaries. The English force, by contrast, likely numbered somewhere closer to 12 to 15,000 men, a significant army by the standards of the period, but considerably smaller than what they would soon be facing. Recognising the danger of being caught in the open by a French force of that scale, and needing to find a defensible position from which to make a stand or, failing that, a route to escape toward the Low Countries where English allies could provide support, Edward III turned his army northward, marching toward the coast in search of advantageous ground. It was near the small village of Crécy-en-Ponthieu, in late August of 1346, that the king finally found the position he was looking for. A gently sloping hillside with flanks protected by terrain features that would limit the French cavalry's ability to manoeuvre and outflank his forces. It was here, on the 26th of August, 1346, that one of the most consequential battles in medieval European history was fought. And it was here that Edward of Woodstock, the 16-year-old prince who had spent his entire short life being prepared for exactly this moment, would have his trial by fire in the most literal and brutal sense imaginable. Crécy, a 16-year-old, wins his spurs. The English army that drew itself up on the slopes above Crécy on the morning of the 26th of August, 1346, was arranged according to a careful, deliberate tactical plan, one that reflected everything English commanders had learned, sometimes through painful experience, about how to defeat a numerically superior force reliant on heavy cavalry. Edward III divided his army into 3 main battles, or divisions, positioned along the slope with archers arranged on the flanks in formations that would allow them to pour converging fire into any attacking force advancing up the hill. The king himself commanded a reserve force positioned at the rear, from a vantage point, according to some accounts, atop a windmill that gave him a clear view of the entire field. And the vanguard, the foremost division, the one that would bear the brunt of the initial French assault, was placed under the nominal command of his 16-year-old son, Edward of Woodstock. This was an extraordinary decision, and historians have debated its implications ever since. Some have suggested it reflected genuine confidence in the prince's developing martial abilities, a calculated bet that the boy was ready for the responsibility being placed on him. Others have suggested it was, at least in part, a deliberate piece of theatre, a way of publicly demonstrating to the army and to the watching world that the heir to the English throne was willing to share the danger faced by every common soldier on that field, a powerful symbol of leadership that could only strengthen morale among the men preparing to face an army that significantly outnumbered them. Whatever the precise calculation behind the decision, the practical effect was that Edward of Woodstock found himself, at 16 years old, standing at the front of the English line as one of the largest French armies assembled in a generation began advancing toward his position. The battle that followed has become, in the centuries since, one of the most studied engagements in medieval military history, not merely because of its outcome, though the outcome was certainly dramatic, but because of what it revealed about the changing nature of warfare itself. The French army's approach to the battlefield was, by most contemporary accounts, somewhat disorganised. King Philip VI had intended to halt his advancing forces and allow them to properly organise and rest before launching any assault, recognising that his army, having marched for much of the day, was tired and not ideally positioned for an immediate engagement. But communication and discipline within the sprawling multinational French force broke down almost immediately. Word to halt either failed to reach the leading elements of the army, or was simply ignored by nobles eager for glory and contemptuous of what they perceived as a smaller, weaker English force standing in their path. The result was a chaotic, piecemeal advance, rather than the coordinated assault that might have given the French a genuine chance of overwhelming the English position through sheer weight of numbers. The first to engage were the Genoese crossbowmen, professional mercenaries hired by the French crown, who advanced to soften the English position before the cavalry charge that was meant to follow. What happened next has become almost legendary in the history of medieval warfare. The crossbowmen, exhausted from a long march, and reportedly without their large protective shields, which had been left behind with the baggage train in the rush to engage, found themselves badly outmatched by the English and Welsh longbowmen, arrayed on the slopes above them. The longbow, in skilled hands, could be loosed far more rapidly than a crossbow, perhaps 10 to 12 aimed shots per minute compared to 2 or 3 for even an experienced crossbowman, and the English archers had the additional advantage of higher ground and, according to several chronicle accounts, a sudden rain shower earlier in the day that may have affected the crossbow strings more severely than the longbows, though this detail is debated among historians. Whatever the precise combination of factors, the result was devastating. The Genoese were cut down in droves, and those who survived began to retreat in disorder, falling back through the ranks of the French cavalry that had been advancing behind them. What followed was by any measure a catastrophic breakdown of French battlefield discipline. Rather than allowing the retreating crossbowmen room to withdraw and regroup, several French noble commanders, interpreting the retreat as cowardice, or simply too consumed with battle fever and contempt for common mercenary soldiers to care, ordered their cavalry to charge directly through and over the fleeing Genoese, cutting many of them down in the process. The cavalry charge that followed, now disorganized, partially obstructed by the chaos of trampled and fleeing crossbowmen, and advancing uphill against a prepared defensive position, slammed into withering arrow fire from the English longbowmen and then into the disciplined ranks of dismounted English men-at-arms waiting at the front of the line. This was the formation under Edward of Woodstock's nominal command, the division that bore the initial brunt of wave after wave of French cavalry charges throughout the remainder of the afternoon and into the evening. The fighting in the prince's section of the line grew so intense at certain points that, according to one of the most famous anecdotes associated with the entire battle, his position was nearly overrun, and an urgent request was sent back to King Edward III, stationed at his vantage point in the rear, asking for reinforcements. The king's reported response has become one of the most repeated lines in English military legend. Asked whether his son was dead, wounded, or unhorsed, and told that he was none of these but was in danger of being overwhelmed, the king is said to have replied that he should be allowed to win his spurs, that the day should be his, and the honour of it should belong to him and to those into whose care he had been entrusted. We should treat this story with the same careful scepticism we apply to most colourful chronicle anecdotes from this period, since it comes to us primarily through the writing of Jean Froissart, a chronicler whose work is invaluable, but also notoriously prone to dramatic embellishment in service of a good story. But whether the exact words were spoken or not, the underlying reality the story reflects is broadly accurate. The prince's division held its position through repeated, desperate French assaults, without the king committing his reserve forces to rescue them, and by holding, the young Edward of Woodstock earned, in the most literal and brutal sense imaginable, the reputation that would follow him for the rest of his life. The battle raged on for hours, with French commanders launching what chroniclers describe as somewhere between 15 and 16 separate cavalry charges against the English position, each one breaking apart against the combination of longbow fire and disciplined infantry resistance, each one adding to the mounting pile of dead and wounded men and horses accumulating on the slopes below the English line. By the time darkness finally brought an end to the fighting, the scale of the French disaster was almost beyond comprehension. Estimates of French casualties vary considerably among different sources, but most modern historians place the number of French dead somewhere in the range of 1,500 to 4,000 men-at-arms and knights, an extraordinarily high toll for the period, particularly given how many of the dead represented the cream of French aristocratic military leadership. Among the dead was King John of Bohemia, a blind ally of the French crown who, according to legend, insisted on being led into the thick of the fighting by his knights, so that he might strike at least one blow against the enemy despite his blindness. A story that, true or not, captures something of the desperate, almost suicidal bravado that characterized much of the French nobility's conduct that day. English casualties, by stark contrast, were remarkably light, likely numbering in the low hundreds, a disparity so extreme that it shocked contemporaries across Europe and forced a fundamental reassessment of how warfare between heavily armoured cavalry and disciplined infantry supported by massed archery would be conducted going forward. For Edward of Woodstock, the Battle of Crécy was transformative in a way that went far beyond the immediate military outcome. He had stood at the front of an English division that absorbed wave after wave of attacks from what was, by reputation, the finest heavy cavalry force in Europe, and he had not broken. Whatever the precise level of his personal tactical decision-making during the battle, which was almost certainly guided heavily by the experienced commanders surrounding him, the symbolic weight of his presence at the front of that line, 16 years old, sharing the same danger as every common soldier under his nominal command, was immense. Chroniclers across Europe began writing about the young English prince who had fought at Crécy with a kind of awed fascination, and the legend of his courage under fire began to spread rapidly, both within England, where it fed directly into the propaganda machine his father had been carefully cultivating for years, and across the continent, where it began to establish the reputation that would, in time, make his name synonymous with English martial prowess, and, depending on which side of the channel you were standing on, either heroic chivalry or terrifying brutality. There is a detail from the aftermath of Crécy that has become particularly associated with Edward of Woodstock in popular memory, though its historical accuracy is somewhat contested. According to tradition, the prince took as a personal emblem, following his exposure to the body and equipment of the slain King John of Bohemia on the battlefield, the blind king's distinctive crest of 3 ostrich feathers, along with his motto Ich diene, meaning I serve in German. This emblem, the famous 3 feathers badge, has remained associated with the Prince of Wales title down to the present day, appearing on royal heraldry and, more recently, on everything from rugby jerseys to currency. Whether the precise origin story involving King John of Bohemia's crest is accurate, and historians have raised reasonable doubts about the details, the broader symbolic resonance of the connection, a young prince who had just fought through the bloodiest and most consequential battle of his young life, adopting an emblem associated with one of the most dramatic and tragic deaths of that very battle, captures something of how quickly Crécy became woven into the mythology surrounding Edward of Woodstock's identity. In the immediate aftermath of the battle, the English army, despite its dramatic victory, was still in a precarious strategic position, far from home, having sustained the physical and logistical strain of weeks of hard campaigning. Rather than attempting to press deeper into French territory, King Edward III turned his army northward toward the coast, marching to the port town of Calais, which he placed under siege in early September of 1346. The siege of Calais would drag on for nearly a year, becoming, in its own right, a significant episode in the broader war, most famously remembered today for the story of the burghers of Calais, the town's leading citizens who offered themselves as sacrifices, walking out to the English camp with nooses around their necks, in exchange for the king's mercy toward the rest of the town's population, a story later immortalised in Auguste Rodin's famous sculpture. Edward of Woodstock participated in this lengthy siege as well, gaining further experience in the grinding, patient, less glamorous side of medieval warfare that stood in stark contrast to the explosive intensity of the Crécy battlefield. Calais eventually fell to the English in August of 1347 and would remain an English possession for over 2 centuries, a strategically vital foothold on the continent that English commanders would use repeatedly in the decades and centuries to come. By the time the prince returned to England following the conclusion of the Calais campaign, he was no longer simply the heir to the throne, a boy being groomed for an eventual future role. He was, in the eyes of his father's court, of the broader English nobility, and increasingly of observers across Europe, a proven warrior who had stood at the front of one of the most decisive battles of the era, and emerged with a reputation for courage that would only continue to grow in the years that followed. He was not yet 18 years old. The Order of the Garter and a new kind of knighthood. The years immediately following Crécy and the fall of Calais saw King Edward III embark on a deliberate and quite remarkable project of cultural and chivalric institution building, one in which his son, now firmly established as a celebrated young warrior, would play a central role. In or around 1348, the king founded what would become one of the most prestigious and enduring chivalric orders in European history, the Order of the Garter. Its precise origins remain somewhat shrouded in legend, most famously associated with the story of a garter falling from the leg of a noblewoman, possibly Joan of Kent during a court dance, and the king's chivalrous response, picking up the garter himself and declaring in French, "Honi soit qui mal y pense," meaning roughly, "Shame on him who thinks evil of it," a phrase that remains the order's motto to this day. Whether this particular origin story is literally true, or, as many historians suspect, a later romanticised embellishment of a more mundane administrative founding, the Order of the Garter itself was very real and very consequential, becoming a deliberate instrument through which Edward III sought to bind the most accomplished and most loyal members of the English aristocracy, including his own sons, into a tight, prestigious fraternity explicitly modelled on the legendary Round Table of King Arthur. Edward of Woodstock was among the founding members of the order, one of the original 26 knights inducted into its ranks. A clear and deliberate signal of the prince's status not merely as heir to the throne, but as a genuine, celebrated exemplar of the chivalric ideal his father was working so hard to cultivate and promote. The Order of the Garter was based at Windsor Castle, which Edward III was extensively rebuilding and expanding during this period, transforming it into a kind of physical monument to English chivalric culture, complete with a dedicated chapel, elaborate feast days, and ceremonial gatherings designed to project an image of English knighthood as the finest and most accomplished in all of Christendom. This was not idle vanity, or rather, it was not only idle vanity. It served important political functions as well. By creating an exclusive, prestigious order centred around royal patronage and explicitly tied to demonstrated martial achievement, Edward III was building a powerful mechanism for binding the loyalty of his most capable nobles directly to the crown, rewarding proven battlefield service with a form of honour that money alone could not purchase. For Edward of Woodstock, his place within this carefully constructed world of chivalric ceremony and tournament culture was, by this point in his young life, entirely natural. He had been raised within exactly this milieu, trained from boyhood in precisely the skills and the codes of conduct the Order of the Garter was designed to celebrate, and his genuine battlefield achievement at Crécy gave him a credibility within this world that mere ceremonial participation could never have provided. He participated regularly in tournaments throughout these years, jousting and competing in mock combats that were, despite their performative and ceremonial elements, genuinely dangerous undertakings, capable of producing serious injury or even death, and the prince's continued success and visible courage in these contests only further cemented his growing reputation. It is worth pausing here to reflect a little on what chivalry actually meant in practice during this period, because it is a concept that has, over the centuries since, accumulated a great deal of romantic gloss that does not always align neatly with the messier historical reality. Chivalry, as it operated in 14th century English and French aristocratic culture, was simultaneously a genuine, deeply held ethical framework, one that emphasized courage, loyalty, generosity, and the protection of the weak, and also a highly performative system of social display, one closely tied to questions of status, reputation, and the accumulation of honour through publicly recognised acts of valour. These two dimensions of chivalry, the sincere ethical commitment and the theatrical performance of status, were not necessarily in tension with one another in the minds of medieval aristocrats, who tended to see genuine virtue and the public recognition of that virtue as deeply intertwined, almost inseparable concepts. A knight who behaved with courage and honour but whose deeds went unrecognised had, in a meaningful sense, failed to fully realise the purpose of chivalric virtue, which was understood not merely as private moral excellence, but as a publicly enacted social good, something that inspired others, that brought honour to one's lineage and one's lord, and that, ideally, contributed to the broader stability and order of Christian society. Edward of Woodstock embodied this synthesis about as completely as any figure of his generation. His courage at Crécy was, by all available evidence, genuine and substantial, not merely the product of careful propaganda spin, but it was also immediately and deliberately transformed into a powerful public narrative, woven into the broader story his father's court was constructing, about the renewed glory of English arms, repeated and embellished by chroniclers, celebrated in tournament and feast, and ultimately crystallized into the kind of legendary reputation that would follow him and continue to grow for the remainder of his life and well beyond it. This period of the late 1340s also saw the prince beginning to take on more substantive administrative and political responsibilities, alongside his continued military and chivalric activities. As Duke of Cornwall, and increasingly in various other capacities tied to his position as heir to the throne, he was responsible for the management of substantial estates and revenues, a role that required him to develop skills quite different from those needed on the battlefield, skills in administration, in the management of household officers and stewards, in the careful balancing of income and expenditure that would become particularly important once he eventually assumed direct rule over his own substantial territories in France. The household accounts and administrative records that survive from this period while not the kind of material that makes for thrilling narrative storytelling, give historians valuable insight into the practical day-to-day realities of how a medieval prince's establishment actually functioned. The purchase of horses and armour, the wages paid to household knights and clerks, the management of hunting forests and agricultural estates that provided his income. It is, I think, worth remembering this less glamorous dimension of his life, because it would have occupied a substantial portion of his actual time and attention, even during years more commonly remembered for battlefield glory. But the relative calm of this period, the years of tournament, ceremony and administrative development between the triumph at Crécy and the next great campaign that would further cement his legend, was about to be shattered by a catastrophe that would touch every corner of European society, one far more devastating and far more indiscriminate than any battlefield, no matter how bloody. In the autumn of 1348, plague arrived in England. The Black Death and a changed England. The pestilence that swept across Europe beginning in the late 1340s has come to be known to history as the Black Death, and it stands as one of the most catastrophic demographic events in recorded human history, killing, by most modern scholarly estimates, somewhere between a third and a half of the entire population of Europe within the space of just a few devastating years. The disease, now generally believed to have been primarily bubonic plague, though almost certainly accompanied in many cases by its even deadlier pneumonic variant, spread along established trade routes from Central Asia, reaching the Mediterranean ports of Italy in the late 1340s before spreading with horrifying speed across the rest of the continent. It reached the southwestern coast of England in the summer of 1348, most likely arriving through the port of Melcombe in Dorset, and from there it began its relentless, indiscriminate march across the kingdom. For Edward of Woodstock, now 18 years old and basking in the considerable glory of his Crécy reputation, the plague years represented an entirely different kind of test, one that no amount of chivalric training or tournament experience could have prepared him for. There was no enemy to charge, no battle line to hold, no clear and visible adversary against which courage and martial skill could be meaningfully deployed. The Black Death moved through medieval society with a terrifying randomness, claiming peasant and noble alike, sparing neither the pious nor the powerful, and the sheer scale of mortality it produced shattered, at least temporarily, many of the social and economic structures that had defined medieval English life for generations. The royal family itself was directly touched by tragedy during this period. In the summer of 1348, Princess Joan, the King and Queen's second daughter and Edward of Woodstock's younger sister, had been travelling to Castile for a planned marriage to the heir of the Castilian throne, a diplomatic match intended to strengthen English ties with the Iberian Peninsula. She died of the plague in Bordeaux in September of that year, before ever reaching her intended husband, a devastating personal loss for the royal family and a sobering immediate demonstration that no amount of royal status or careful planning could provide protection against the pestilence sweeping across the continent. It is worth pausing on this loss, because it is easy, when narrating the life of a famous warrior prince, to focus exclusively on battles and glory, and to lose sight of the very real personal griefs that punctuated even the most celebrated medieval lives. Edward of Woodstock lost a sister to the plague before he had even turned 19 years old, a sister he had grown up alongside in the crowded, noisy royal nursery of his childhood. The broader social and economic consequences of the Black Death in England were, in their own way, every bit as significant as the immediate human tragedy of the mortality itself. With somewhere between a third and a half of the population dead within just a couple of years, the entire structure of the English agricultural economy was thrown into upheaval. Labour, which had previously been abundant and cheap, suddenly became scarce, and surviving peasants and labourers found themselves possessing a degree of economic bargaining power that would have been almost unimaginable just a few years earlier. Wages for agricultural labour began rising sharply as landowners, desperate to find enough workers to bring in harvests, competed for a suddenly diminished pool of available labour. This shift alarmed the English aristocracy considerably, who saw their traditional economic and social privileges threatened by what they regarded as the dangerous, destabilising demands of a peasantry suddenly emboldened by its newfound scarcity value. In 1351, the English Parliament, dominated by precisely this anxious landowning aristocracy, passed the Statute of Labourers, an attempt to legally fix wages at pre-plague levels and to restrict the freedom of labourers to move between employers in search of better pay, essentially attempting to use the force of law to suppress the natural economic consequences of the labour shortage the plague had created. This statute and the broader social tensions it reflected would simmer for decades, eventually contributing to the explosive social unrest of the Peasants' Revolt in 1381, though that uprising would occur after Edward of Woodstock's own death and falls slightly beyond the scope of his personal story. But it is worth noting here, because it illustrates how the plague years, even as they receded somewhat in immediate mortality through the early 1350s, continued to reverberate through English society for generations, reshaping the fundamental economic and social relationships between landowner and labourer in ways that would ultimately, over the following century and beyond, help dissolve much of the rigid manorial system that had characterised English feudal society for centuries. For the prince himself, the plague years appear to have been a period of relative quiet on the military front, an enforced pause in the grand campaign of conquest his father had envisioned, as the practical logistics of mounting major continental warfare became considerably more difficult amid the demographic chaos sweeping through both England and France. France, it should be said, suffered every bit as severely from the plague as England did, perhaps in some regions even more severely, and the mutual devastation experienced by both kingdoms contributed to a temporary, uneasy lull in major hostilities through the early 1350s, as both sides found themselves consumed by the more immediate and pressing challenge of simply managing the catastrophic human and economic toll of the pestilence. This is not to say the period was entirely without notable events for the prince. He continued to participate in tournaments and chivalric gatherings when circumstances allowed, continued to manage his substantial estates and revenues as Duke of Cornwall, and continued his slow, steady accumulation of political experience and administrative responsibility that would serve him well in the years to come. There is also something worth noting about the broader cultural response to the Black Death within English aristocratic and religious culture during this period. A heightened, often anxious turn toward religious devotion, toward elaborate funerary monuments and chantry foundations meant to secure prayers for the souls of the dead, and toward an intensified, sometimes almost morbid preoccupation with mortality and the fragility of earthly glory that pervaded much of the art and literature produced in the decades following the plague's first devastating wave. The famous danse macabre imagery depicting death-leading figures from every rank of society, from pope and king down to peasant and beggar, in an endless procession toward the grave, became an enduring and powerful artistic motif precisely during this period, a visual reminder that the plague had, however briefly, levelled the usual distinctions of medieval social hierarchy, at least in the universal vulnerability it exposed to mortal disease. By the mid-1350s, however, as both England and France slowly began to recover from the worst immediate ravages of the plague, even as recurring outbreaks would continue to strike intermittently for generations to come, the larger machinery of the 100 Years' War began grinding back into motion, and it was during this period of renewed conflict that Edward of Woodstock would step into a role that represented a significant escalation in both his personal responsibility and his enduring historical legacy, taking on direct, independent command of English forces and territories in southwestern France, a role that would ultimately produce both his greatest military triumph and, eventually, the controversial episode that would forever complicate his reputation, Gascony and the prince's own court. To understand the next major phase of Edward of Woodstock's life, we need to spend a little time understanding the region that would become, for the better part of 2 decades, the centre of his personal power and the stage for his most significant achievements and his most consequential failures, Gascony, the southwestern French territory, more broadly known by the English as Aquitaine. This region, centred around the prosperous wine trading city of Bordeaux, had been linked to the English crown for nearly 2 centuries by this point, ever since Eleanor of Aquitaine, one of medieval Europe's most formidable and fascinating royal figures, had brought the territory into the English orbit through her marriage to Henry II in the 12th century. The relationship between Gascony and the English crown was, by the time of Edward of Woodstock, a complicated, often fraught arrangement. Technically a French fief held by the English king, who was, in a legal sense, that French monarchs found deeply uncomfortable, and that English monarchs found equally uncomfortable to acknowledge, supposed to owe feudal homage to the King of France for his possession of the territory. This awkward, ambiguous legal relationship, an English king simultaneously a sovereign monarch in his own right, and, at least in theory, a vassal of the French crown for his French possessions, had been a persistent source of tension and conflict for generations, and it sat right at the heart of the broader disputes that had helped trigger the 100 Years' War in the first place. Gascony itself was economically vital to the English crown, particularly through its enormously lucrative wine trade, which generated substantial customs revenue and supplied a significant portion of the wine consumed across England. The local Gascon nobility, for their part, had developed over generations a complicated relationship with both the English and French crowns, generally preferring the relatively distant and less intrusive overlordship of the English king, who tended to interfere less directly in local Gascon affairs than French monarchs were inclined to do, while also maintaining their own substantial degree of local autonomy and self-interest that could shift, sometimes quite dramatically depending on which side seemed to offer the better terms at any given moment. In 1355, King Edward III made the significant decision to grant his eldest son direct, substantial authority over this crucial region, appointing him as the king's lieutenant in Gascony, a role that would, in the following years, evolve into the even more formal and substantial title of Prince of Aquitaine. This was a major escalation in the prince's responsibilities, transforming him from a celebrated young warrior operating under his father's direct command into an independent ruler in his own right, responsible for the governance, defence, and administration of a substantial and economically vital territory, while also serving as the primary instrument of English military strategy in the southwestern theatre of the ongoing war with France. The prince arrived in Gascony in September of 1355, establishing his court and base of operations in Bordeaux, and almost immediately set about preparing for what would become one of the most famous and devastatingly effective chevauchées of the entire 100 Years' War. This campaign, launched in October of 1355, would take English forces on a punishing, deliberately destructive march from Bordeaux southeastward toward the Mediterranean coast, through some of the richest and previously least war-affected territory in southern France, a region that, unlike Normandy, or the areas closer to the more frequently contested northern frontier, had not experienced the direct devastation of English campaigning in previous decades. It is worth pausing here to discuss in some detail exactly what a chevauchée actually involved in practice, because this style of warfare, which Edward of Woodstock would come to practice with particular skill and ruthlessness, was strategically quite distinct from the kind of pitched battle warfare that produced engagements like Crécy. A chevauchée was, at its core, a large-scale mounted raid, deliberately designed not to capture and hold territory in any permanent sense, but rather to inflict maximum economic damage on enemy territory, burning towns and villages, destroying crops and agricultural infrastructure, seizing or slaughtering livestock, and generally devastating the economic productive capacity of the region being raided. The strategic logic behind this approach was multifaceted. It denied the enemy crown crucial tax revenue from the devastated regions, undermining its ability to finance its own military efforts. It demonstrated, in the most brutally visible way imaginable, the French king's inability to protect his own subjects, a powerful piece of political theatre intended to undermine confidence in the legitimacy and competence of the French crown, and it potentially provoked the French king into risking a pitched battle to stop the destruction, a battle the English, given their demonstrated tactical advantages with longbow-supported infantry, generally welcomed. The chevauchée Edward of Woodstock launched in October of 1355 has come to be remembered by historians, with a certain grim precision, as one of the most devastating campaigns of its kind in the entire war. Over a period of roughly 2 months, the prince's forces marched approximately 600 miles, a staggering distance for a medieval military campaign conducted largely on horseback through hostile territory, cutting a path of destruction through Languedoc, sacking and burning towns including Carcassonne, though notably sparing the heavily fortified citadel itself, and reaching as far as Narbonne on the Mediterranean coast before turning back toward Bordeaux. Contemporary and near-contemporary chronicle accounts describe the campaign in terms that, even allowing for the typical hyperbole of medieval chroniclers, paint a picture of truly extensive devastation, with the prince's own dispatches back to England boasting of the scale of destruction inflicted, including claims of having burned hundreds of towns and villages along the route. I want to address something directly here, because I think it is important not to gloss over the genuinely brutal human cost of this style of warfare, in service of telling a more comfortable heroic narrative. The chevauchées that Edward of Woodstock conducted throughout this period of his career were, by any reasonable modern ethical standard, deliberate campaigns of economic terrorism directed primarily against civilian populations and civilian economic infrastructure. While medieval warfare in general operated according to ethical and legal norms quite different from those we apply today, and while the chevauchée was a recognised and within the chivalric framework of the period, broadly accepted tactic of warfare between Christian princes, the actual human experience of the peasants and townspeople whose homes, crops, and livelihoods were destroyed in these campaigns was, unsurprisingly, one of profound suffering and devastation. This is a tension that runs throughout the entire story of Edward of Woodstock, between the celebratory, chivalric framing that dominated how his contemporaries and subsequent generations of English commentators tended to discuss his military career and the much darker, more troubling reality of what that career actually meant for the ordinary people of the French regions he campaigned through. We will return to this tension and to its most extreme and most controversial expression later in this story when we discuss the infamous sack of Limoges. But it is worth establishing here, at this earlier point in the narrative, that the foundations of Edward of Woodstock's military reputation, the very campaigns that built his legend as a feared and effective commander, were substantially built upon exactly this kind of deliberate large-scale destruction of civilian property and livelihood. The 1355 chevauchée achieved its broader strategic objectives quite effectively, demonstrating English military reach deep into southern French territory that had previously felt relatively insulated from the war, generating substantial plunder and ransom income for the prince and his soldiers, and significantly undermining confidence in the French crown's ability to protect its subjects. But it did not, on this occasion, succeed in provoking the kind of pitched battle confrontation that might have produced another decisive English victory along the lines of Crécy. The French forces in the region, under the local command of the Count of Armagnac, generally avoided direct confrontation, recognizing the tactical disadvantages that had proven so catastrophic for French armies in previous engagements, and the prince's forces returned to Bordeaux in December of 1355, having inflicted enormous economic damage, but without the kind of decisive battlefield victory that would truly cement Edward of Woodstock's reputation as one of the great commanders of his age. That decisive victory, however, was not far off. As the prince settled into the practical business of governing his new principality through the early months of 1356, managing the complicated, often fractious politics of the Gascon nobility, overseeing the administration of justice and taxation across his territories, and beginning preparations for what would become an even more ambitious campaign, events were already beginning to move toward what would become the single most celebrated and most consequential battle of his entire military career, an engagement that would not merely demonstrate English tactical superiority on the battlefield, as Crécy had done a decade earlier, but that would actually result in the capture of the King of France himself, an outcome so dramatic, so strategically transformative, that it would reshape the entire course of the 100 Years' War for the better part of a generation. The road to Poitiers. The campaign of 1356 began, in many ways, as a continuation of the strategic logic that had defined the previous year's devastating raid through Languedoc. King Edward III had developed by this point in the war a coordinated multi-pronged strategic approach to pressuring the French crown, launching simultaneous or near-simultaneous campaigns from multiple directions in order to stretch French military resources thin and prevent King John II of France, who had succeeded his father Philip VI in 1350, from concentrating his forces effectively against any single English threat. In the summer of 1356, this strategy called for Edward of Woodstock to launch a major chevauchée northward from Gascony, while the Duke of Lancaster simultaneously conducted operations in Normandy, theoretically creating a pincer effect that would prevent King John from adequately responding to either threat. The prince's forces departed Bordeaux in early August of 1356, marching northward through Poitou and toward the Loire Valley, conducting the now familiar pattern of destructive raiding as they advanced, burning and pillaging towns along their route while gathering substantial plunder. This was a smaller force than the army that had triumphed at Crécy a decade earlier, likely numbering somewhere in the range of 6,000 to 7,000 men, a mix of English and Gascon men-at-arms, longbowmen, and other supporting troops, considerably outnumbered by the substantial French royal army that King John was assembling in response to this latest English incursion into the heartland of his kingdom. As the campaign progressed through August and into September, it became increasingly clear to the prince and his advisors that King John was mobilizing a major royal army, one significantly larger than the relatively modest force under English command, and that this French force was maneuvering to intercept and cut off the English line of retreat back toward the relative safety of Gascon territory. This was a genuinely precarious strategic situation, considerably more dangerous, in purely numerical terms, than the circumstances King Edward III had faced a decade earlier in the lead-up to Crécy. Estimates of the French Royal Army's size vary among different sources, but most modern historians place it somewhere in the range of 14,000 to 20,000 men, including a substantial contingent of the finest heavily armoured cavalry and infantry the French crown could muster, drawn from across the kingdom in response to King John's urgent calls for military support against this latest, deeply humiliating English incursion into the very heart of his realm. Recognising the danger of his position, with his smaller, plunder-laden army increasingly at risk of being trapped and cut off from any line of retreat, Edward of Woodstock began attempting to extract his forces back toward Gascon territory, while simultaneously, according to most chronicle accounts, engaging in genuine diplomatic efforts to avoid a direct battlefield confrontation that, given the substantial French numerical advantage, carried real risk of catastrophic defeat. The Pope, Innocent VI, deeply concerned about the human cost of the ongoing conflict between two of the great Christian powers of Europe, had dispatched cardinal legates to attempt to broker some form of truce or negotiated settlement before battle could be joined, and these negotiations occupied much of the period leading directly up to what would become the climactic confrontation of the campaign. By the middle of September 1356, the two armies had manoeuvred into close proximity near the city of Poitiers, with the French Royal Army under King John effectively positioned to block the English line of retreat and force a confrontation that the numerically superior French side had every reason to believe would result in a decisive, crushing victory. The prince's forces, exhausted from weeks of hard campaigning and burdened with the substantial plunder accumulated during the chevauchée, found themselves in a genuinely difficult position, with negotiations for a peaceful resolution ultimately failing to produce an agreement acceptable to both sides. According to several chronicle accounts, Edward of Woodstock, recognising the seriousness of his strategic predicament, was prepared to offer substantial concessions to avoid battle entirely, including the return of much of the plunder his forces had accumulated and an extended truce. But King John, confident in his substantial numerical advantage, and perhaps eager to finally deliver the kind of decisive victory over English forces that had eluded French commanders since the catastrophe at Crécy a decade earlier, was unwilling to accept terms that did not include the prince's outright surrender, a demand the prince and his commanders predictably refused to entertain. With diplomatic efforts having failed, both sides began preparing for what would become one of the truly decisive battles of the entire 100 Years' War. The prince selected a defensive position near the village of Noyers-Maupertuis, a few miles south of Poitiers itself, choosing ground that, much like his father had done a decade earlier at Crécy, offered significant natural advantages to a smaller, defensively positioned force facing a numerically superior attacking army. The terrain featured hedges, vineyards, and a sunken lane that would significantly restrict the ability of French cavalry to mount the kind of broad, coordinated charges that heavy cavalry traditionally relied upon for maximum effectiveness, forcing any attacking force to funnel through relatively narrow, easily defensible approaches where the English and Gascon longbowmen and dismounted men-at-arms could concentrate devastating defensive fire and resistance. On the eve of the battle, as both armies settled into their respective positions and made their final preparations for what all parties understood would be a momentous and likely extremely bloody confrontation, the cardinal legate dispatched by Pope Innocent VI made one final desperate attempt to broker a peaceful resolution, shuttling between the two camps in an effort to find some compromise that might avoid the bloodshed both sides were clearly bracing for. These efforts ultimately failed. As King John remained committed to forcing the decisive battlefield confrontation he believed would finally avenge the humiliation of Crécy and restore French military prestige, while Edward of Woodstock, having exhausted reasonable diplomatic options and facing what amounted to a demand for unconditional surrender, prepared his forces for what would become, the following day, one of the most consequential and most studied battles of the entire medieval period. Poitiers, the capture of a king. The Battle of Poitiers, fought on the 19th of September 1356, would prove to be in many respects an even more dramatic and strategically consequential engagement than Crécy had been a decade earlier, not merely replicating the earlier battle's demonstration of English tactical superiority against heavily armoured French cavalry and infantry, but producing an outcome so extraordinary, so far beyond what either side could reasonably have anticipated at the outset of the engagement, that it would fundamentally reshape the strategic balance of the entire 100 Years' War for years to come. The French army, having organised itself into 4 major divisions, or battles, following the kind of tactical structure typical of medieval armies of this period, began its assault in the morning hours, with the 1st Division, commanded by the Dauphin Charles, the king's 18-year-old eldest son and heir, advancing against the prepared English defensive position. This initial assault, much like the early French attacks at Crécy a decade earlier, ran directly into the kind of devastating combination of longbow fire and disciplined infantry resistance that had already proven so catastrophically effective against French forces in previous engagements. The narrow, hedge-lined approaches that Edward of Woodstock had selected for his defensive position significantly limited the French cavalry's ability to deploy effectively, forcing attacking forces to funnel through restricted spaces where they became concentrated, vulnerable targets for the English archers positioned to deliver converging fire from multiple angles. The Dauphin's division, after sustained and bloody fighting, was eventually forced to withdraw, having sustained significant casualties without achieving any meaningful breakthrough against the English position. Crucially, and this detail would prove enormously significant to the eventual outcome of the battle, the Dauphin and his immediate commanders, recognizing the heavy losses already sustained and perhaps influenced by the broader strategic imperative of preserving the royal succession given that Charles was the direct heir to the French throne, withdrew their forces from the field entirely rather than continuing to press the attack, a decision that would later attract considerable criticism, but that, in the immediate tactical circumstances, likely reflected a reasonable assessment that continued assault against the well-prepared English position was unlikely to succeed. The 2nd French Division, commanded by the Duke of Orléans, the king's brother, followed a broadly similar pattern, advancing against the English position, encountering the same devastating combination of longbow fire and disciplined defensive resistance, and ultimately withdrawing from the field without achieving a meaningful breakthrough, reportedly without even fully engaging the main English line in the kind of sustained, committed assault that might have given French forces a genuine chance of overwhelming the smaller English force through sheer concentrated pressure. This left King John II himself, commanding the 3rd and largest division of the French army, the final and most substantial body of French forces remaining on the field, with 2 of the 4 planned French divisions having already withdrawn without achieving their objectives. It was at this critical juncture in the battle that Edward of Woodstock and his commanders made a decision that would prove to be one of the most consequential tactical choices of the entire engagement, and indeed of the entire war. Rather than continuing to maintain a purely defensive posture, absorbing whatever final assault King John's forces might mount, the prince ordered a coordinated counterattack, combining a direct frontal assault by his dismounted men-at-arms with a flanking manoeuvre executed by a small mounted force under the command of the Captal de Buch, a Gascon noble commander that swept around the French position and struck the royal division from the rear and flank simultaneously with the frontal assault. This combined assault, executed with precise timing and coordination, that speaks to the genuine tactical sophistication that had developed within Edward of Woodstock's command structure by this point in his military career, threw King John's forces into chaos. The French Royal Division, already having absorbed significant casualties and disorder from the preceding hours of fighting, found itself simultaneously pressed from the front and struck unexpectedly from the flank and rear, a combination that broke the cohesion and morale of even the substantial remaining French force. What had begun as an organised, if increasingly desperate, French royal assault dissolved rapidly into chaotic close-quarters fighting, with significant numbers of French soldiers attempting to flee the field entirely as the battle turned decisively against them. It was in the midst of this chaotic final phase of the fighting that one of the most extraordinary outcomes of the entire battle, indeed one of the most extraordinary outcomes of the entire 100 Years' War, occurred. King John II himself fighting on foot alongside his youngest son Philip, who according to chronicle accounts famously called out warnings to his father throughout the battle, alerting him to threats approaching from his blind side, a detail that has earned Philip the enduring nickname the Bold in subsequent historical memory, found himself increasingly surrounded as the French formation around him collapsed under the pressure of the English and Gascon counterattack. Rather than being killed in the chaotic close-quarters fighting, as might easily have happened given the brutal, confused nature of medieval battlefield combat at this stage of an engagement, King John was eventually recognised, surrounded, and ultimately compelled to surrender, becoming the highest-ranking prisoner captured in battle in the entire medieval period up to that point, an outcome so extraordinary, so strategically consequential, that it would reshape the diplomatic and political landscape of the entire ongoing conflict for years to come. The scene of the king's actual capture has been described in various, somewhat differing chronicle accounts, with some versions suggesting a degree of confusion and even danger in the immediate aftermath of his surrender, as multiple English and Gascon soldiers, recognizing the enormous ransom value of capturing the French king personally, reportedly began competing and even physically struggling over who would have the honour and, crucially, the financial reward of being recognized as his actual captor. According to several accounts, it was ultimately a relatively obscure Gascon knight named Denis de Morbec, himself an exile from French royal favour, who had taken service with the English crown, who was generally credited with formally receiving King John's surrender and escorting him to safety amid the chaos of the collapsing French formation, though the precise details of exactly how and by whom the king was actually taken into custody remains somewhat contested among different chronicle sources. The broader French casualties sustained during the battle were substantial, though somewhat less catastrophic in absolute terms than the devastation inflicted at Crécy a decade earlier, with most modern estimates suggesting somewhere in the range of 2,500 French dead, alongside a very substantial number of additional prisoners taken, including, alongside the king himself, a remarkable concentration of the highest-ranking French nobility, providing the English crown with an extraordinary windfall of ransom opportunities that would generate enormous financial benefit over the following years. English and Gascon casualties, by contrast, were once again remarkably light relative to the scale and intensity of the engagement, a pattern consistent with the broader tactical advantages that disciplined, longbow-supported defensive positions had repeatedly demonstrated against heavily armoured cavalry-centred French military doctrine throughout this phase of the war. Chivalry and captivity, the treatment of King John, what happened in the immediate aftermath of the battle, and in the months that followed as Edward of Woodstock managed the genuinely extraordinary diplomatic and logistical challenge of having personally captured the reigning King of France, a thing that essentially never happened in medieval warfare. Kings were supposed to be ransomed eventually, sure, but actually taken alive on the field of battle was a different matter entirely, has become, in many respects, just as central to his enduring historical legend as the battlefield victory itself. The prince's treatment of his captured royal prisoner has been celebrated by generations of chroniclers and historians as one of the finest demonstrations of genuine chivalric courtesy in the entire medieval period. A striking and, by most accounts, largely accurate counterpoint to the brutal, destructive warfare that had characterized so much of his earlier military career. It is, I think, one of those moments in history that sounds almost too neat, too perfectly scripted, to have actually happened the way the chroniclers describe it. And yet the broad outline does appear to hold up reasonably well under historical scrutiny, even if some of the finer details have likely been polished and embellished in the retelling. According to Jean Froissart's celebrated chronicle account, on the evening following the battle, amid what must have been an almost surreal atmosphere of exhaustion, blood, and disbelief at the scale of what had just occurred, Edward of Woodstock personally hosted King John at a feast in his own quarters. He did not have the captured king led off to some guarded tent and fed whatever rations happened to be available. He served the captured French monarch himself, by Froissart's account, taking on the role of host rather than captor, a deliberate inversion of the power dynamic that must have struck everyone present as a remarkable piece of theatre, even if it was also, by every indication, a genuine expression of the prince's own values. He offered King John words of consolation and respect regarding his conduct in the battle that had just concluded so disastrously for the French cause, which is, if you stop to think about it, a fairly extraordinary thing to do. Here was a man who had just inflicted one of the worst military humiliations in French royal history on his guest, and his response was to sit the man down to dinner and tell him he had fought well. The prince reportedly praised King John's personal courage and conduct on the battlefield, expressing genuine admiration for the king's willingness to fight on foot alongside his men even as the broader battle turned decisively against French forces, rather than fleeing or surrendering at the first sign of disaster the way a less committed commander might have done. And he assured John that he would receive treatment befitting his royal status during what both men understood, even in that very first evening, would be an extended period of captivity while ransom negotiations proceeded. Negotiations that, as we will see, would in fact drag on for years. This pattern of remarkably courteous treatment did not fade once the initial drama of the battlefield receded into memory. It continued throughout the subsequent journey back to England and through the extended period of King John's captivity there, which speaks, I think, to something more than mere battlefield theatre or momentary chivalric impulse. The French king was housed during much of his captivity in considerable comfort, initially at various locations as arrangements were sorted out, before eventually being lodged at the Savoy Palace in London, one of the grandest aristocratic residences in the entire kingdom, a palace so magnificent that its very name would later become a byword for luxury hospitality, an irony that would have amused absolutely no one in the 14th century, but tends to raise an eyebrow now. There, John was permitted to maintain something approximating royal state, with his own substantial household, regular entertainments, hunting privileges, and a degree of personal freedom that stood in stark contrast to how a prisoner of war might typically have been expected to be treated by anyone's standards, medieval or modern. This was not a man rotting in a dungeon. This was a man who, by some accounts, ran up such extravagant personal expenses during his captivity, on wine, on astrologers, on various comforts and entertainments, that his English captors occasionally had to extend him credit to cover his own household bills, which is frankly one of the more darkly comic footnotes in the entire story of the 100 Years' War. Imagine being held prisoner so luxuriously that you managed to go into debt while doing it. This treatment reflected at least two things operating simultaneously, and I think it is worth separating them out rather than collapsing them into a single tidy explanation. On one hand, there were genuine chivalric ideals at work regarding the proper treatment of a captured noble prisoner of equivalent or superior rank, ideals that Edward of Woodstock appears to have internalized deeply and sincerely throughout his upbringing, the same code of conduct that had shaped his entire education and that he had spent years performing and embodying within the tournament culture of his father's court. On the other hand, there was also, quite practically, the enormous financial and diplomatic value that King John represented as a hostage, a value that depended substantially on his being kept alive, healthy, and, ideally, in reasonably good spirits. A French king held in poor conditions or treated with visible cruelty would have generated considerable reputational damage to English chivalric prestige, undermining exactly the kind of carefully cultivated image of noble, superior English knighthood that the Plantagenet court had spent decades constructing. A French king treated with conspicuous courtesy and respect, even in captivity on the other hand, served to enhance rather than diminish that broader narrative of English chivalric superiority. It let England have it both ways. We defeated you so thoroughly that we captured your king, and we are so secure in our own martial and moral superiority that we can afford to treat him like an honoured guest. That is a remarkably effective piece of propaganda, whether or not anyone involved was thinking of it in quite those calculating terms at the time. I think it is worth dwelling on this episode for a moment longer, because it captures something genuinely important about the complicated, often contradictory nature of Edward of Woodstock's broader historical reputation, a contradiction we're going to keep bumping into throughout the rest of this story. This is, after all, the same man who, just months earlier, had led a chevauchée through Languedoc that burned hundreds of towns and villages, inflicting enormous suffering on countless ordinary peasants and townspeople, who had no say whatsoever in the dynastic and political disputes that had triggered the war in the first place. Those people did not get a feast. They did not get a comfortable palace and hunting privileges. They got their homes burned and their crops destroyed, and history has, for the most part, simply not bothered to record their names. And yet, when it came to the treatment of a captured royal prisoner, a man of equivalent aristocratic and chivalric status to himself, the prince displayed a degree of genuine courtesy and personal respect that has been celebrated, with considerable justification, as a remarkable example of chivalric idealism in practice. This contrast between brutal indifference toward the suffering of common people and elaborate, genuine courtesy extended toward fellow aristocrats, even enemy aristocrats, even a man whose kingdom he had just spent years actively devastating, tells us something important about the actual moral framework within which medieval chivalric culture operated. It was a framework that was, in practice, deeply hierarchical and class-bound, extending its protections and its idealized standards of conduct primarily to those who occupied positions of noble status, while largely excluding the much larger population of ordinary peasants and townspeople from any meaningful protection under that same chivalric code. It is not that medieval chivalry was hypocritical exactly, at least not by its own internal logic. It simply never claimed to be a universal ethic in the first place. It was a code for knights, about knights, policing the conduct of knights toward other knights. Everyone else existed largely outside its concern. King John was eventually transported back to England in the spring of 1357, accompanied by Edward of Woodstock himself, in a journey that became, in its own right, a remarkable piece of carefully staged political theatre, perhaps the most carefully staged piece of theatre in the prince's entire career. And that is saying something given how much of his life had already involved deliberate public performance. The prince arranged the procession through London in a manner calculated to emphasise his own modesty and the dignity owed to his royal captive. According to the chronicles, he mounted King John on a magnificent white horse, the kind of mount that practically glowed with royal symbolism, while he himself rode a much more modest black palfrey alongside him, a smaller, plainer animal entirely unsuited to advertising the rider's own victory. It is a small detail, but I think it is genuinely worth pausing on, because the easier, more obviously self-glorifying choice would have been the reverse, the triumphant young prince on the magnificent horse, the defeated king trudging along on something humbler. Edward of Woodstock, or whoever was advising him on the optics of the procession, chose precisely the opposite arrangement, and the effect was a visual demonstration of chivalric humility that was clearly intended to enhance rather than diminish English prestige in the eyes of the watching London crowds, and by extension, in the eyes of the broader European audience that would inevitably hear of the carefully orchestrated spectacle through the rapid, gossiping network of merchants, diplomats and chroniclers that carried news across the continent. The London crowds, by most contemporary accounts, turned out in genuinely enormous numbers to witness the procession, a fitting public celebration of what was, by any measure, one of the most extraordinary military and diplomatic triumphs in the entire history of the English crown, the kind of spectacle that people would have talked about for the rest of their lives, the day they saw the King of France ride through London on a white horse, captured by a prince barely out of his 20s. For Edward of Woodstock personally, the capture of King John at Poitiers represented the absolute zenith of his military reputation, cementing a legend that had already been substantially established a decade earlier at Crécy, but that now reached a level of celebrated fame that few medieval commanders, before or after, would ever achieve, and arguably none would achieve in quite this particular way again. He returned to England in the spring of 1357, not merely as a celebrated young warrior who had distinguished himself in battle, which would have been impressive enough on its own, but as the man who had personally captured the King of France, an achievement of such extraordinary magnitude that it would echo through European political and diplomatic affairs for the remainder of the century, and would secure his place in English popular memory and historical mythology for centuries to come, long after the precise details of treaties and ransoms had faded from common memory and only the broad, gleaming outline of the story remained. The Treaty of Bretigny and an uneasy peace. The years immediately following the dramatic capture of King John were dominated by the complex, often frustratingly slow, diplomatic process of attempting to translate this extraordinary military triumph into a lasting political settlement. France, in the absence of its captured king, descended into a period of considerable internal political turbulence, with the young Dauphin Charles attempting to govern the kingdom amid widespread popular unrest, including the dramatic and violent Jacquerie peasant uprising of 1358, a brutal episode of class warfare that erupted partly in response to the cumulative pressures of plague, ongoing warfare, heavy taxation, and the perceived failures of the French aristocracy to adequately protect the peasantry from English raiding, a failure that had been rendered all the more visible and humiliating by the catastrophic capture of the king himself. Negotiations for King John's eventual release dragged on for several years, complicated by the enormous scale of the ransom being demanded, the broader territorial concessions England was seeking as part of any comprehensive peace settlement, and the practical difficulties France faced in raising the necessary funds amid the considerable economic disruption the kingdom had experienced through years of plague and warfare. Edward III, for his part, continued to press the strategic advantage that his son's extraordinary victory at Poitiers had created, launching further campaigns into French territory through the late 1350s, including a major expedition in 1359 and 1360 that, while not producing another battlefield victory on the scale of Crécy or Poitiers, continued to apply considerable pressure on the already weakened and destabilized French crown. These continued military pressures eventually culminated in the negotiation of the Treaty of Bretigny, concluded in May of 1360, one of the most significant diplomatic settlements of the entire 100 Years' War. Under the terms of this treaty, King Edward III agreed to renounce his formal claim to the French throne, the very claim that had originally helped trigger the conflict decades earlier, in exchange for substantial territorial concessions, including full sovereign control, free of any feudal obligation of homage to the French crown, over a greatly expanded Aquitaine, encompassing not merely the traditional Gascon territories, but a much larger swath of southwestern France, alongside Calais and several other northern French territories. King John, for his part, agreed to pay an enormous ransom for his eventual release, a sum so substantial that France would struggle to fully raise it for years to come, leading to complicated arrangements involving the temporary detention of various French royal hostages, including eventually King John's own son, the Duke of Anjou, as security for the outstanding ransom payments. For Edward of Woodstock, the Treaty of Bretigny set the stage for the next major phase of his life and career. His formal elevation, in 1362, to the title of Prince of Aquitaine, granted direct sovereign authority over the greatly expanded territories that England had secured through the treaty, a position that would make him, in practical terms, an independent ruler of one of the wealthiest and most extensive territories in all of Europe, answerable to his father, the King of England, in only the most nominal and ceremonial sense. Before that elevation, however, there was a significant personal development in the prince's life that deserves attention here. His marriage in 1361 to Joan of Kent, a marriage that has attracted considerable historical interest, and, in its own time, generated no small amount of surprise and even controversy within the English court. Joan, often remembered by the somewhat romantic, though likely largely retrospective nickname the Fair Maid of Kent, was Edward of Woodstock's own cousin, the daughter of Edmund of Woodstock, Earl of Kent, who had himself been a son of King Edward I and was therefore the prince's great-uncle, making Joan and the prince first cousins once removed. This degree of close family relation required a papal dispensation to permit the marriage, which was duly obtained, but the relationship carried additional complications beyond simple consanguinity. Joan had, by the time of her marriage to the prince, already been married twice before, in circumstances that had generated considerable scandal and legal complexity earlier in her life. As a young woman, she had apparently entered into a secret marriage with a knight named Thomas Holland, conducted without the knowledge or consent of her family, before subsequently being married, while Holland was away on crusade, to William Montague, the Earl of Salisbury, in an arrangement her family had apparently believed to be entirely legitimate, unaware of her earlier secret union with Holland. This produced a genuinely complicated legal and ecclesiastical tangle, eventually resolved through papal intervention, that recognised her original marriage to Holland as the legitimate union, dissolving her subsequent marriage to Montague and restoring her to Holland, with whom she had several children before his death in 1360. It was following Thomas Holland's death that Edward of Woodstock, who had reportedly known and been close to Joan for many years, possibly harbouring genuine personal affection for her going back to their shared childhood years at court, moved relatively quickly to secure her hand in marriage himself, a decision that surprised many contemporaries given both Joan's complicated marital history and the fact that, as a celebrated royal prince approaching the height of his political and military influence, he might reasonably have been expected to pursue a more conventional, diplomatically advantageous foreign royal marriage, rather than marrying a twice previously wed English cousin, however charming and accomplished she may genuinely have been. This decision tells us something potentially quite interesting and human about Edward of Woodstock, suggesting a man whose choices were not always governed purely by cold political calculation, who was capable of genuine personal affection and, apparently, willing to pursue a marriage that brought relatively limited diplomatic advantage compared to what might have been available to him, in favour of what does genuinely appear to have been a marriage based, at least to some meaningful degree, on personal preference and affection rather than pure dynastic strategy. Their marriage, by most surviving accounts, appears to have been a genuinely warm and successful one, producing two sons, Edward of Angoulême, born in 1365, who would tragically die in childhood, and Richard of Bordeaux, born in 1367, who would eventually succeed his grandfather as King Richard II of England, becoming, in a quirk of dynastic succession, king without his own father ever having lived to inherit the throne himself, a development we will discuss in considerably more detail later in this story. Prince of Aquitaine, power and splendour. With his formal elevation to the title of Prince of Aquitaine in 1362, Edward of Woodstock entered into what would become, in many respects, the most personally and politically significant phase of his entire adult life. For the first time, he was not a son acting under the shadow and direction of his father, not a commander operating within someone else's larger strategic vision. He was, in practice, a sovereign in his own right, taking up direct independent rule over a vast and extraordinarily wealthy continental territory, governing from his court at Bordeaux with a degree of authority that few English princes, before or since, have ever genuinely possessed. It is worth sitting with that for a moment, because it is easy to read past it as just another title in a long list of titles. But this was something categorically different from being Duke of Cornwall or even Prince of Wales, both honours he also held. This was an actual kingdom in everything but name, and he was about to discover over the following decade that ruling one is a very different skill set from conquering one. The territory under his direct rule was, by any contemporary standard, genuinely staggering in its scope. It encompassed the rich wine-producing regions around Bordeaux that had long generated substantial revenue for the English crown, the kind of revenue that had made Gascon claret a fixture on English tables for generations, alongside the considerably expanded territories secured through the Treaty of Bretigny, including Poitou, Limousin, Périgord, and several other substantial regions of southwestern France. Taken together, this was an aggregate territory of such size and wealth that it arguably made the Prince of Aquitaine, in purely material terms, one of the wealthiest and most powerful individual rulers in all of Christendom, rivaling many of the actual kingdoms of Europe in terms of sheer territorial extent and economic resources. He was, by some measures, governing more land and commanding more revenue than several reigning monarchs elsewhere on the continent, all while technically still being a prince rather than a king. It is the kind of arrangement that only makes sense within the peculiar, layered feudal logic of the medieval world, where titles and actual power did not always line up in the ways we might expect. The prince established at Bordeaux a court of remarkable, deliberately ostentatious splendour, and I do mean deliberate. This was not simply a man who happened to enjoy fine living, although by every indication he did enjoy it enormously. The magnificence of his court was a calculated political instrument, explicitly designed to project an image of sophisticated, almost dazzling chivalric rulership that would impress and bind the loyalty of the often fractious and independent-minded Gascon nobility, a population who had, despite generations of English overlordship, never entirely lost their own substantial sense of regional identity and autonomy. You cannot simply conquer the loyalty of proud regional lords through paperwork and tax collectors. You have to give them something to be proud of, something to belong to, and Edward of Woodstock seems to have understood this instinctively, building a court that Gascon nobles would actually want to be part of, rather than merely a bureaucracy they were forced to tolerate. The household accounts and surviving administrative records from this period of his rule paint a genuinely vivid picture of life at Bordeaux, and if you enjoy the small, granular details of history the way I do, these records are something of a treasure trove. There is lavish expenditure recorded on tournaments, feasts, and elaborate ceremonial occasions, the kind of events that would have drawn knights and nobles from across the region, eager to participate in or simply witness the spectacle. And running alongside all that glamour, often in the very same ledgers, is the far less glamorous but equally essential business of actual governance, the administration of justice, the collection of taxation and customs revenue, the unglamorous grind of managing complicated, often delicate political relationships with the various local lords and territorial magnates whose loyalty and cooperation were essential to the effective functioning of his rule. It is a useful reminder, I think, that even the most romantic chivalric courts of medieval Europe ran, underneath all the velvet and trumpets, on the same dull machinery of tax rolls and court records that keeps any government functioning, then or now. It is worth noting here that this period of the prince's life, while certainly reflecting the continued accumulation of personal glory and prestige that had characterized his earlier military career, the Crécy reputation, the Poitiers reputation, all of it following him to Bordeaux and adding considerable lustre to his new role, also began to reveal some of the more difficult, less straightforwardly heroic dimensions of his character and his broader political situation. Glory, as it turns out, is expensive to maintain. The sheer scale of expenditure required to keep a court of this magnificence running, combined with the very real ongoing costs of maintaining military garrisons and administrative infrastructure across such an extensive territory, placed considerable financial strain on the prince's resources, strain that would, in the coming years, push him toward fiscal and political decisions that would generate significant resentment and resistance among his Gascon subjects. This strain did not announce itself all at once. It built slowly, almost invisibly at first, the way most financial crises tend to, a little more spent here, a little more borrowed there, until eventually the underlying instability became impossible to ignore, ultimately contributing to the unravelling of much of what he'd worked so carefully to build during this golden early period of his rule. The Gascon nobility, for their part, were not an easy population to govern, and anyone hoping to rule them successfully needed more than just a magnificent court and a famous battlefield reputation. While they generally preferred English overlordship to direct French rule, given the relatively greater degree of local autonomy and self-governance the English crown had traditionally permitted compared to the more centralising instincts of the French monarchy, they were nonetheless a fiercely independent-minded political community. These were lords accustomed to a substantial degree of consultation and negotiation in matters of taxation and governance, men who expected to be asked, or at least to feel as though they had been asked, before new financial demands were placed upon them. They were not the sort of population that would simply accept whatever fiscal demands their new prince might choose to impose upon them from on high, however celebrated that prince might be for his exploits on foreign battlefields. Reputation bought him a great deal of goodwill at the start. It did not buy him indefinite patience. Edward of Woodstock's governing style, it must be said, was not perfectly suited to managing this particular kind of political relationship. It had been shaped substantially by his upbringing within the more centralised hierarchical political culture of the English crown, a system where, broadly speaking, royal authority flowed downward and was expected to be obeyed rather than negotiated, and it had perhaps been further influenced, in ways that are entirely understandable even if they proved politically costly, by the very real sense of personal grandeur and entitlement that his extraordinary military achievements at Crécy and Poitiers had reasonably engendered in him. Put yourself in his position for a moment. You captured a king of France. You stood at the front of the line at 16 and did not break. By the time you are governing your own principality in your 30s, it would be almost strange if you did not carry yourself with a certain expectation of deference. The trouble is that the Gascon lords, for all their respect of his battlefield achievements, did not necessarily share that same instinct toward automatic deference when it came to matters touching their own purses and their own traditional privileges. This was a mismatch, subtle at first, between a ruler accustomed to command and a political community accustomed to consultation, and it was a mismatch that would have increasingly significant consequences as his rule progressed through the following years, consequences we will spend considerable time exploring later in this story. But I do not want to rush too quickly past the genuine splendour of this period, because for a number of years it really was splendour, and it is worth letting ourselves sit in it a little before the financial and political troubles begin creeping in around the edges. This period also saw the prince continue to cultivate the broader chivalric and cultural reputation he had built throughout his earlier career, hosting tournaments and ceremonial occasions at Bordeaux that drew participants and visitors from across Europe, not merely from England and Gascony, but from further afield, knights and nobles eager to test themselves, or simply to be seen at what had quickly become one of the most celebrated courts on the continent. He maintained a court renowned for its sophistication and its careful, deliberate performance of chivalric ideals, the same ideals that had been instilled in him since boyhood at Windsor, now finding their fullest, most lavish expression on a stage entirely of his own making. By most contemporary accounts, the court at Bordeaux during this period rivaled, in terms of its splendour and its cultural prestige, many of the great royal courts of Europe, a testament both to the extraordinary wealth of the territories under the prince's rule and to the careful, deliberate cultivation of chivalric magnificence that had been, in many ways, the defining project of his entire life and career up to this point. If Crécy and Poitiers had made him famous as a warrior, Bordeaux, for a time at least, made him famous as something else entirely, a prince who could hold court with the same confidence and command with which he had once held a battle line, surrounded by music, feasting, and the bright performative theatre of chivalry at its most self-consciously magnificent. It would not last forever, almost nothing in this story does, but for a few years in the middle of the 1360s, Bordeaux genuinely was, by the standards of the age, one of the most dazzling courts in all of Christendom, and Edward of Woodstock, not yet touched by the illness that would eventually consume him, sat at the very centre of it. Castile and the Black Prince's last great campaign, it was against this backdrop of magnificent but increasingly financially strained princely rule that Edward of Woodstock embarked in the mid-1360s on what would become his final major military campaign, an undertaking that would, in many respects, mark the beginning of the long, painful decline that would characterize the remaining years of his life. There is something almost cruelly fitting about how this story unfolds, because the very campaign that would seal his reputation as one of the greatest field commanders of the entire medieval period is also the campaign that, quietly and almost incidentally, planted the seeds of the illness that would eventually kill him. He rode into Spain as the most feared knight in Europe. He rode out of it, technically victorious, but carrying something inside him that no amount of chivalric glory could cure. This campaign involved English intervention in a complicated dynastic civil war unfolding in the neighbouring kingdom of Castile. A conflict that drew in, on opposing sides, both England and France, transforming what might otherwise have remained a relatively contained Iberian succession dispute into yet another front in the broader ongoing struggle between the two great powers of Western Europe. It is one of those moments in history where you can almost watch a regional squabble get absorbed, almost against its will, into a much larger and more consequential rivalry, the way a small stream gets pulled into the current of a much bigger river. The conflict centred on King Pedro of Castile, a controversial and genuinely divisive figure remembered by history under two starkly contrasting epithets: the cruel by his detractors and the just by his more sympathetic chroniclers, which tells you almost everything you need to know about how slippery historical reputation can be, depending entirely on who happens to be holding the pen. His harsh and often violent methods of consolidating royal authority had generated substantial opposition among the Castilian nobility, the kind of opposition that tends to accumulate quietly for years before erupting all at once, and it eventually coalesced around Pedro's illegitimate half-brother, Henry of Trastamara, a rival claimant with the considerable advantage of not being widely despised by his own aristocracy. Henry, with substantial French and papal support, including military assistance from the famous mercenary captain Bertrand du Guesclin, one of the great soldiers of fortune of the entire period, a man whose career deserves its own telling on another night, launched a successful campaign to overthrow Pedro and seize the Castilian throne for himself in 1366. It was, in essence, a French-backed coup dressed up in the language of a domestic succession dispute, and Pedro found himself, rather abruptly, a king without a kingdom. Pedro, driven into exile following his defeat, made his way to Bordeaux, where he sought the assistance of Edward of Woodstock in restoring him to his throne. This is, I think, a useful moment to pause and imagine the scene. A deposed king arriving at the glittering court of the Black Prince, hat in hand, more or less, asking for an army. Pedro offered, in exchange for that army, substantial financial compensation and territorial concessions, promises that, given the prince's ongoing financial pressures in maintaining his increasingly expensive Aquitanian court, proved considerably attractive. We talked earlier about just how costly it was to keep Bordeaux running at the level of splendour Edward of Woodstock had built it up to, and here, conveniently, was a desperate exiled king dangling exactly the kind of windfall that might solve those mounting financial headaches. It must have looked, at least on paper, like an answer to a prayer. The decision to intervene on Pedro's behalf has attracted significant historical debate and criticism, both from contemporaries and from subsequent generations of historians, and frankly, I think the scepticism is well earned. Pedro's reputation for cruelty was not some minor footnote or the product of hostile propaganda alone. There were genuinely troubling stories attached to his rule, accusations of murder within his own family, a pattern of ruthlessness that made plenty of people, even in a century not exactly known for its gentleness, uncomfortable. And there is the broader, more strategic question hanging over the whole enterprise as well, whether the considerable risks and costs of mounting a major military campaign into Iberia, crossing mountains, supplying an army far from any familiar territory, exposing soldiers to an unfamiliar climate and unfamiliar diseases, were genuinely justified by the prospective benefits being offered. Hindsight, of course, makes this an easy question to answer. At the time, weighed against an empty treasury and a tempting promise of repayment, the calculation must have looked considerably less reckless than it does to us now, looking back from the comfortable distance of 700 years. Nonetheless, Edward of Woodstock committed to the campaign, and he did so in a fairly characteristic way, assembling a substantial army that included not merely his own Anglo-Gascon forces, the seasoned corps of soldiers who had served him loyally through years of campaigning, but also a significant contingent of so-called free companies. These were mercenary bands of unemployed soldiers, men left more or less professionally idle by the periods of relative peace between major campaigns of the 100 Years' War, and idle soldiers, as it turns out, are rarely harmless. These free companies had been operating with considerable destructive effect across French territory in the lulls between major campaigns, essentially turning to banditry and extortion on a grand scale, because nobody was paying them to fight anyone in particular. Pedro's cause, in this light, provided a remarkably convenient and, for the prince, financially beneficial outlet for exactly this kind of restless, dangerous manpower. Better, from Edward of Woodstock's perspective, to point these men at a foreign battlefield than to leave them terrorising the French countryside, although it is worth noting that this solution was rather better for France than it ultimately was for him. The campaign that followed was conducted through genuinely difficult terrain and challenging logistics, crossing the Pyrenees with an army of this size being no small undertaking in the 14th century, and then campaigning across the unfamiliar landscape of the Iberian Peninsula, far from the supply lines and local knowledge that had served English forces so well in France. It would culminate in April of 1367 at the Battle of Nájera, where the prince's forces decisively defeated the combined Castilian and French forces supporting Henry of Trastamara. And if you've been listening closely to this story so far, the tactical shape of this victory should sound almost familiar by now, because in terms of its execution, it replicated many of the same principles that had proven so devastatingly effective at Crécy and at Poitiers, with disciplined English and Gascon infantry, and longbowmen inflicting heavy casualties on the opposing forces. It is almost remarkable, watching this pattern repeat itself a third time on foreign soil, how consistently this particular combination, discipline, defensive positioning, and the sheer punishing rate of fire from massed longbowmen, continued to dismantle larger, more conventionally organised armies wherever Edward of Woodstock chose to deploy it. Whatever else can be said about him, the man understood how to win a battle. And yet the victory at Nájera, while a genuine and significant battlefield triumph that further enhanced Edward of Woodstock's already formidable military reputation, the kind of victory that should have been the crowning achievement of an already extraordinary career, proved in retrospect to be something of a Pyrrhic achievement for the prince personally. This is where the story takes its turn, where the glittering surface starts to crack. Pedro, once restored to his throne through the bloodshed of English and Gascon soldiers, proved reluctant, or perhaps simply unable, to fully honour the substantial financial compensation he had promised in exchange for that assistance. I do not think it requires much imagination to picture how that conversation, or series of conversations, must have gone. A restored king, suddenly back in possession of his own treasury and his own priorities, finding himself considerably less eager to hand over enormous sums to a foreign prince, now that the foreign prince's army had already done its job and gone home, or rather, had not yet gone home and was, in fact, waiting rather impatiently to be paid. Pedro, it seems, had been a far more generous and accommodating ally when he was a desperate exile with nothing to lose than he was once he had a crown back on his head. This left the prince to bear the enormous costs of the entire campaign largely from his own resources, a financial burden that would have devastating long-term consequences for his rule in Aquitaine, consequences that, as we will see, would soon push him toward the kind of unpopular taxation that would finally fracture his relationship with his own Gascon subjects. But the financial betrayal, painful as it was not even the most consequential cost of the Castilian campaign. There is a quieter, far more personal toll that the historical record only lets us glimpse from a distance, through the slow accumulation of evidence in the years that followed. The campaign itself, conducted through the difficult, disease-prone conditions of Iberian campaigning during the warmer months of the year, conditions that medieval armies, with their limited understanding of sanitation and their inevitable exposure to contaminated water and poor provisioning, were always brutally vulnerable to, appears to have been the occasion during which Edward of Woodstock first contracted the serious, debilitating illness that would plague him for the remainder of his life. We do not know with any real precision what exactly struck him down on that campaign. The chroniclers were not physicians, and even physicians of the period would not have had the diagnostic tools to tell us anything we could fully trust today. But whatever it was, it took hold of him somewhere in Spain, in the aftermath of his greatest tactical triumph, and it never fully let go. It is a strange and almost unbearably ironic detail when you sit with it for a moment, that the very campaign which should have stood as the final glittering confirmation of his invincibility, a third decisive victory to sit alongside Crécy and Poitiers, was simultaneously the campaign that quietly, invisibly, began undoing him. He rode home from Najera still the most celebrated soldier in Europe. He just did not yet know that he was also riding home with the thing that would, slowly and relentlessly, take that reputation apart piece by piece, year by year, gradually but relentlessly undermining the physical health and vigour that had been so central to his earlier reputation as a fearsome and seemingly invincible warrior. The Black Prince, in other words, had just won his last great battle. He simply did not know it yet. The long decline, illness takes hold. The precise nature of the illness that began afflicting Edward of Woodstock during or shortly after his return from the Castilian campaign remains a matter of some historical uncertainty and debate, and I think it is worth being honest with you about that uncertainty, rather than pretending to a confidence the sources simply do not support. Modern medical historians have proposed various possible diagnoses, working backward from the somewhat limited and imprecise descriptions of his symptoms that survive in contemporary chronicle accounts, descriptions that were written by men trained in theology and Latin grammar, not in medicine, and certainly not in anything resembling clinical observation as we would understand it today. Suggestions have ranged from various forms of dysentery, a common and often fatal affliction among medieval armies operating in unfamiliar climates and conditions, the kind of illness that quietly killed more soldiers in this period than any battlefield ever did, to other possible gastrointestinal or systemic conditions, including various theories involving nephritis or other kidney-related ailments, conditions that would certainly fit the picture of a slow, grinding, years-long decline rather than a sudden collapse. But no definitive modern medical consensus has been reached, and frankly none ever will be, given the inherent limitations of trying to diagnose a man who has been dead for nearly 7 centuries, using nothing more than a handful of vague chronicle descriptions written by people who were far more interested in the moral and political meaning of his suffering than in its underlying physiology. What is clear from the historical record, regardless of which particular medical label we might want to attach to it, is that whatever the precise nature of his condition, it proved to be a progressive, debilitating, and ultimately fatal illness, one that would gradually but relentlessly diminish the prince's physical capabilities and his ability to actively command military campaigns or to manage the day-to-day demands of governing his extensive territories over the remaining decade of his life. This represents, I think, one of the genuinely poignant and tragic dimensions of his broader life story, and it is worth pausing here rather than rushing past it, because there is something quietly devastating buried in this turn of events. Here was a man whose entire identity and reputation had been built so substantially around his demonstrated physical courage and martial prowess on the battlefield, a man who had stood at the front of the line at 16 years old and refused to break, who had ridden 600 miles through hostile territory burning towns as he went, who had personally led the counterattack that captured a king of France. And now, gradually but inexorably, he found himself losing the very physical capacity that had defined his celebrated public persona, forced to confront the reality of declining health and diminishing capability during what should otherwise have been the prime years of his adult life and rule, the years in which a man of his rank and reputation should have been at the absolute height of his powers, not watching them slip away a little more with each passing season. There is no battle for that. No amount of courage, no amount of disciplined longbow fire, no clever flanking maneuver could be deployed against the slow erosion happening inside his own body. It must have been, I think, one of the cruelest ironies a man so thoroughly defined by physical triumph could possibly have been asked to endure. The financial consequences of the Castilian campaign, meanwhile, were not content to remain a private burden quietly carried alongside his declining health. They spilled, almost inevitably, into the political life of his principality, combining with the prince's already strained fiscal position, from years of maintaining his magnificent Aquitanian court to create pressures that would have significant political consequences in the years immediately following his return from Iberia. We have already talked about just how expensive it was to keep Bordeaux running at the level of splendour he had built it up to, the tournaments, the feasts, the ceremonial magnificence that had been so central to winning and holding the loyalty of his Gascon subjects. Add to that the enormous, largely unrecovered costs of the Najera campaign, debts that Pedro of Castile's failure to deliver the promised compensation had left the prince to bear almost entirely from his own resources, and you have the makings of a genuine fiscal crisis, the kind that no amount of chivalric prestige could simply paper over indefinitely. Faced with these mounting debts, Edward of Woodstock made what would prove to be a politically fateful decision in 1368 to impose a new tax known as a feuage or hearth tax across his Aquitanian territories, a levy intended to help recoup some of the enormous costs the Castilian campaign had imposed on his already strained treasury. On paper, it must have seemed like a reasonable enough solution. He had spent a fortune restoring a foreign king to his throne, in part because doing so promised to ease his own financial troubles, and when that promise evaporated, recovering the cost from his own territories probably felt, to him, like simple necessity rather than provocation. It did not feel that way to the people being asked to pay it. This decision proved to be deeply unpopular among the Gascon nobility, and I think it is worth remembering everything we discussed earlier about exactly who these Gascon lords were and what they expected from their rulers. Many of them had already harboured growing resentments regarding what they perceived as the increasingly centralised, financially demanding nature of the prince's rule over the preceding years, the sense that decisions were being handed down to them rather than negotiated with them, in a manner that sat uneasily with their own long-standing traditions of consultation and local autonomy. The hearth tax in this context was not simply an unwelcome financial burden. It was confirmation of exactly the pattern of governance they had been growing increasingly uneasy about for years. A prince who, for all his earlier glory and all his earlier charm, was beginning to treat their consent as something of an afterthought. Several prominent Gascon lords, most significantly the Count of Armagnac and the Lord of Albret, refused to accept the new taxation outright, and rather than simply grumbling about it locally, the way one might expect a regional dispute over taxation to play out, they took a step of enormous and quite deliberate significance, appealing their case directly to the French crown. I want to underline just how provocative this move actually was, because it is easy to read past it as a simple bureaucratic appeal when it was, in fact, almost an act of open political defiance dressed up in the language of legal procedure. This appeal carried enormous, deliberately provocative legal and political significance, since it implicitly challenged the very sovereignty that the Treaty of Bretigny had supposedly granted to England over the expanded Aquitanian territories, a sovereignty that had been explicitly, painstakingly negotiated to exist free of any continuing French feudal overlordship or right of appeal. The entire point of that treaty, from the English perspective, had been to sever Aquitaine from any French legal claim once and for all. By appealing to the French crown, these Gascon lords were essentially declaring that, whatever the treaty said on parchment, they still considered the King of France to be the final court of appeal sitting above the Prince of Aquitaine, which is about as direct a challenge to Edward of Woodstock's authority as one could possibly mount without actually picking up a sword, and the French crown, for its part, was more than willing to entertain that challenge. This appeal to the French crown, and the willingness of King Charles V, who had succeeded his father John in 1364, to formally accept and act upon it, set in motion a chain of events that would have consequences reaching far beyond a simple tax dispute. Charles summoned Edward of Woodstock to appear before the French royal court to answer the Gascon lord's complaints, a summons that, on its face, treated the prince as nothing more than an ordinary vassal being called to account by his feudal superior. It is worth pausing to imagine how that summons must have landed at Bordeaux. This was the man who had captured Charles' own father at Poitiers, the man who had escorted that captured king through the streets of London on a white horse while he himself rode modestly alongside. And now Charles, the son, was attempting to summon him to court like a recalcitrant tenant. The prince, predictably and furiously, refused to acknowledge the summons at all, given that it directly contradicted the sovereign independence supposedly guaranteed by the Treaty of Bretigny, and according to one account that has become almost as famous as the summons itself, he is said to have responded that he would indeed come to Paris, but only at the head of 60,000 men. Whether or not those exact words were ever spoken, the sentiment behind them captures the situation perfectly. There was no version of compliance available to him that did not amount to humiliating self-betrayal. This standoff, a tax dispute escalating into a direct challenge over the fundamental sovereignty of an entire principality, effectively reignited the broader Anglo-French conflict that had been, since 1360, sitting in a state of relatively uneasy truce. It is a strange thing to consider that one of the most consequential renewals of the 100 Years' War, a conflict that had already consumed a generation of English and French lives, traces its immediate spark back to a disputed hearth tax in southwestern France. But that is often how these things go in history. A grievance simmers quietly for years, attached to deeper and more structural tensions, until some relatively modest, almost bureaucratic decision finally tips it over into open conflict. This renewed phase of conflict would eventually come to be recognised by historians as essentially a second major phase of the broader 100 Years' War, and it found Edward of Woodstock, now increasingly debilitated by his ongoing illness, facing the considerable challenge of defending his extensive Aquitanian territories against renewed French military pressure, all while his own physical capacity to personally lead military campaigns in the field, the very capacity that had defined his entire earlier career and reputation, was steadily and irreversibly diminishing. The man who had once been the answer to every English military crisis was now, increasingly, watching crises unfold around him that he no longer had the strength to ride out and meet head-on. A deeply uncomfortable new reality for a prince who had spent his entire adult life being the solution rather than the spectator. The sack of Limoges and a darkening legend. It was within this difficult and increasingly desperate context, a prince facing renewed military conflict while his own health steadily failed him, that one of the most controversial and historically consequential episodes of Edward of Woodstock's entire career occurred, an event that has, in the centuries since, become central to ongoing historical debates about the true nature of his character and his legacy. In September of 1370, in response to the city of Limoges having surrendered to French forces under the Duke of Berry, abandoning its allegiance to the English crown, Edward of Woodstock, despite being by this point so severely weakened by illness that he reportedly had to be carried to the siege in a litter, unable to ride a horse, led an English assault to recapture the city, an assault that culminated in what contemporary and near-contemporary chronicle accounts describe as a brutal sack of the city, accompanied by significant civilian casualties. The precise scale and nature of the violence inflicted during the sack of Limoges has become a subject of considerable historical debate and reassessment in recent decades. Jean Froissart's celebrated chronicle, long the primary source for this episode and for much of the broader narrative of Edward of Woodstock's career, describes a scene of horrifying carnage, claiming that as many as 3,000 men, women and children were slaughtered as the prince, carried through the streets in his litter, reportedly watched the violence unfold with what Froissart characterises as a kind of grim, vengeful satisfaction, demanding that the city's inhabitants pay with their lives for what he regarded as their betrayal of their proper allegiance to the English crown. More recent historical scholarship, however, drawing on a broader range of surviving documentary evidence, including local Limousin records and other chronicle sources beyond Froissart's account, has suggested that the actual scale of civilian casualties may have been considerably smaller than Froissart's dramatic, possibly rhetorically embellished figure of 3,000 deaths, with some historians proposing that the actual death toll, while still representing a genuinely brutal and lethal episode of urban sack characteristic of medieval siege warfare more broadly, may have numbered closer to several hundred rather than several thousand, and may have been concentrated more specifically among the defending garrison and combatants, rather than indiscriminately targeting the broader civilian population in quite the systematic, deliberate manner that Froissart's account suggests. This historiographical debate matters, I think, not because it somehow excuses or minimises the genuine violence and suffering that the sack of Limoges undoubtedly involved. Episodes of medieval urban sack were, almost without exception, brutal and traumatic events for the populations who experienced them, regardless of the precise statistical scale of casualties involved, but because it illustrates something important about how historical reputation and legend can become detached, over centuries of retelling and embellishment, from the underlying documented historical reality. Froissart, writing his celebrated chronicles in subsequent decades, was deeply invested in constructing a particular kind of dramatic, morally instructive narrative about the broader course of the 100 Years' War, and the figure of a once glorious chivalrous prince, now reduced by illness and frustrated ambition to a vengeful, almost monstrous figure ordering the indiscriminate slaughter of civilians, served a powerful narrative and moral function within the broader arc of his chronicle, one that may well have led him to dramatise and exaggerate the actual scale of violence involved beyond what the underlying historical evidence can fully support. Whatever the precise historical reality of the casualties involved, the sack of Limoges has become, in subsequent centuries, one of the central pieces of evidence cited by those historians and commentators who have sought to complicate or directly challenge the more straightforwardly heroic chivalric image of Edward of Woodstock that dominated earlier generations of English historical memory and popular culture. It serves as a stark, sobering reminder that the same prince celebrated for his genuine courtesy toward the captured King John of France, following Poitiers, was also capable of, at minimum, ordering and overseeing a brutal military assault on a civilian population that had displeased him through their perceived political disloyalty. A reminder of the deeply class-bound, hierarchical nature of medieval chivalric ethics that we touched on earlier in this story, a code of conduct that extended genuine protection and respect primarily to fellow members of the aristocratic chivalric class, while offering little meaningful protection to the broader population of common townspeople and peasants, whose lives and livelihoods remained perpetually vulnerable to the brutal exigencies of medieval warfare. The Dying Prince and the Fracturing of a Dream. The sack of Limoges marked, in many respects, the effective end of Edward of Woodstock's active military career, the final major campaign he would personally lead, even in the diminished litter-borne capacity that his declining health had by this point forced upon him. In the months that followed, his condition continued to deteriorate, and by early 1371, recognizing that he was no longer physically capable of effectively governing and defending his extensive Aquitanian territories amid the ongoing renewed conflict with France, he made the difficult decision to relinquish his role as Prince of Aquitaine and return to England, departing Bordeaux in January of that year, accompanied by his wife Joan and his young surviving son Richard, never to return to the continental territories that had been the centre of his power and his identity for nearly a decade. This return to England represented in many ways a profound and painful personal and political transition for the prince, a man who had spent so much of his adult life building and ruling a magnificent independent principality, now returning to England as a diminished, chronically ill figure, increasingly marginalised from the active political and military affairs that had defined his entire earlier identity. His relationship with his ageing father, King Edward III, who was himself by this point increasingly elderly and politically dominated by the influence of his mistress, Alice Perrers, and by ongoing factional tensions within the English court, appears to have remained generally affectionate, but the prince's declining health meant he was increasingly unable to play the kind of active political and military role that might otherwise have positioned him to help stabilise the broader governance of the English crown during these difficult years. The remaining years of his life, from his return to England in 1371 until his eventual death in 1376, were dominated by the slow, painful progression of his illness, punctuated by periods of partial recovery that allowed for occasional limited public and political activity, alternating with periods of severe incapacitation that left him largely confined and unable to participate meaningfully in the broader affairs of the kingdom. He did manage, during this period, to participate in the Good Parliament of 1376, one of the most significant parliamentary sessions of the entire medieval period, lending his prestige and support to efforts aimed at curbing corruption within the royal administration and addressing widespread popular grievances regarding taxation and governance, though his declining health meant his direct personal involvement was necessarily limited. This period also brought further personal tragedy, with the death of his elder surviving son, Edward of Angoulême, in 1370, while the family was still in Aquitaine, a devastating loss that left his younger son, Richard, born in 1367, as the sole surviving heir, a child who would, given his father's increasingly evident terminal illness and his grandfather's advancing age, find himself thrust into an unexpectedly direct line of succession to the English throne far earlier in his young life than anyone could reasonably have anticipated when he was born. Death and the unfulfilled crown. Edward of Woodstock died on the 8th of June, 1376 at the Palace of Westminster, at the age of 45, just 1 year short of his father's own death, never having lived to inherit the throne that had been his expected destiny since the moment of his birth at Woodstock 46 years earlier. His death came less than a year before that of his father, King Edward III, who would die in June of 1377, meaning that the throne passed not to Edward of Woodstock, the celebrated warrior prince whose entire life had been oriented toward an eventual kingship that circumstances ultimately denied him, but directly to his young son Richard, who became King Richard II at the tender age of 10, a succession that would, in the following years and decades, produce its own complicated and ultimately quite turbulent chapter of English political history, well beyond the scope of this particular story. The prince's funeral and the elaborate arrangements he had himself specified for his burial reflect, in their careful, deliberate detail, the same characteristic blend of genuine piety and calculated public performance that had characterized so much of his broader life and career. He had specified in considerable and quite precise detail in his will the exact nature of his intended tomb and funerary monument, to be located in Canterbury Cathedral, one of the most important and prestigious religious sites in the entire kingdom, closely associated with the cult of St. Thomas Becket, and a site of enormous pilgrimage significance throughout medieval England. The tomb that was eventually constructed, and that survives to this day in Canterbury Cathedral, remains one of the most remarkable and historically significant medieval funerary monuments in all of England. It features a striking bronze effigy of the prince, depicted in full armour, his hands clasped in prayer, surrounded by an elaborate canopy decorated with his heraldic emblems, including the famous ostrich feathers and motto associated, as we discussed earlier, with his legendary capture of King John of Bohemia's crest at Cressy. Above the tomb hang reproductions of his actual funeral achievements, his helm, shield, gauntlets, and surcoat, original medieval artefacts that have survived, remarkably, for nearly 7 centuries, offering modern visitors an extraordinarily rare and direct physical connection to the actual material world of 14th century chivalric culture. The Latin inscription on the tomb, composed in the prince's own voice as if speaking from beyond the grave, reflects a tone of striking, almost startling humility and mortal reflection, reminding the reader of the universal inevitability of death, regardless of earthly status or achievement, a sentiment entirely consistent with the broader cultural preoccupation with mortality that, as we discussed earlier, had become such a prominent feature of post-plague medieval religious and artistic culture. It is a fittingly reflective, somewhat melancholy final monument for a man whose extraordinary public achievements in youth had given way, in his final years, to the slow, painful, and ultimately unstoppable progression of chronic illness, a man who had spent his entire life being prepared for and expecting an eventual kingship that, in the end, circumstances simply never allowed him to claim. The making of a legend. In the centuries following his death, Edward of Woodstock's historical reputation underwent a complex and in many respects quite fascinating evolution, gradually accumulating the now famous nickname the Black Prince, by which he has come to be most widely known in popular historical memory, though, as we noted at the very beginning of this story, that particular epithet did not actually appear in any surviving contemporary documentary source from his own lifetime. The earliest known written use of the term Black Prince appears to date from several decades after his death, with its precise origin and meaning remaining a subject of ongoing historical debate and speculation. Several competing theories have been proposed to explain the origin of this enduring nickname. Some historians have suggested it derives from the colour of armour he wore, possibly black enamelled plate armour of the kind that would have presented a particularly striking, intimidating visual appearance on the battlefield, though direct contemporary evidence specifically confirming that he habitually wore black armour remains somewhat thin. Others have proposed that the nickname relates not to his physical appearance at all, but rather to the darkness of his reputation among the French populations who had suffered through his devastating chevauchée and, most particularly, the brutal sack of Limoges, a kind of grimly ironic French characterization of a prince whose chivalric reputation among English commentators stood in stark contrast to the genuine terror and suffering his military campaigns had inflicted on countless ordinary French civilians. Still others have suggested more mundane possible explanations, including connections to his heraldic shield, which featured black elements, or even potential confusion or conflation with later 16th century usage and embellishment of his story by Tudor-era chroniclers and playwrights, working centuries after his actual death, who may have themselves contributed to popularizing the nickname through their own retrospective, dramatic and literary treatments of his story. Whatever its precise origin, the nickname has proven remarkably enduring, becoming the dominant lens through which Edward of Woodstock has been remembered and discussed across the subsequent centuries of English historical memory and popular culture, generally cast, particularly within earlier generations of English historical writing, as one of the great heroic figures of the entire medieval period, the very embodiment of chivalric virtue and martial accomplishment, a romanticized symbol of English military prowess and national pride that proved particularly resonant during various later periods of English history, when patriotic, militaristic, historical narratives held particular cultural and political appeal. More recent historical scholarship, as we have discussed at various points throughout this story, has worked to develop a considerably more complicated, more critically nuanced understanding of his actual historical legacy, one that takes seriously both the genuine, well-documented achievements of his military career and his demonstrated capacity for genuine chivalric courtesy, most notably in his celebrated treatment of the captured King John of France, while also reckoning honestly and directly with the very real human cost of his devastating chevauchée and the genuinely troubling episode of the sack of Limoges, refusing to simply flatten his historical legacy into either an uncomplicated heroic narrative or an equally uncomplicated condemnation, but rather attempting to understand him as a genuinely complex historical figure, shaped by and fully embedded within the particular moral and cultural framework of 14th century chivalric warrior aristocracy, a framework that, by modern ethical standards, contained genuine and admirable virtues alongside deeply troubling limitations and blind spots, regarding the value and protection of common human life beyond the narrow circle of fellow aristocratic combatants, beyond the purely historiographical debates regarding how we should ultimately assess and characterize his legacy. Edward of Woodstock's life and career left tangible, lasting marks on English institutional and cultural history that have persisted across the centuries since his death. The title Duke of Cornwall, created specifically for him in his infancy, has remained, ever since, the customary title held by the eldest son of the reigning English monarch. The Order of the Garter, in whose founding he played such a central role, remains to this day the most senior and most prestigious order of chivalry in the entire British honour system, and the famous ostrich feathers badge and Ichthyn motto, associated, as legend has it, with his battlefield encounter with the slain King John of Bohemia at Crécy, remain, even now, closely associated with the title and heraldry of the Prince of Wales, a connection that has persisted across nearly 7 centuries of subsequent English and British royal history. His tomb at Canterbury Cathedral, meanwhile, remains to this day one of the most visited and historically significant medieval monuments in all of England, a tangible physical link to a man whose life and career, for all their genuine complexity and contradiction, undeniably shaped in profound and lasting ways the broader course of English and European history during one of the most consequential and dramatic centuries of the entire medieval period, a century defined by the devastating mortality of the Black Death, the protracted generation-spanning conflict of the 100 Years' War, and the gradual, often painful transformation of medieval European society and warfare that would, in the centuries following his death, eventually give way to the very different world of the early modern period. So tonight we have travelled across the entire arc of a single, remarkable, complicated medieval life, from a hunting lodge nursery at Woodstock to a 16-year-old's trial by fire on the sloping fields above Crécy, from a feast where a captured king dined as an honoured guest to the slow, grinding decline of an illness that no amount of chivalric courage could overcome, and finally to a quiet tomb in Canterbury, where a bronze knight has lain in prayerful stillness for nearly 700 years. It is easy, when we tell stories of medieval knights, to reach instinctively for the language of legend, the unbroken hero, the flawless paragon of courage and virtue. But the actual historical Edward of Woodstock resists that kind of simple flattening. He was, by turns, genuinely courageous and genuinely courteous, a man capable of treating a defeated enemy king with real warmth and respect, and he was also, by turns, the architect of deliberate, devastating campaigns of destruction against people who had no voice in the great dynastic disputes that consumed his life. A man whose final major military action left a city scarred by violence, while he himself, too ill to even sit a horse, was carried through its streets in a litter. Both of these things are true. Both of these things belong to the same man. Perhaps that is, in the end, the quiet lesson tucked away inside this long, sprawling story of crowns and battles and burning towns, that history rarely hands us figures who are simply good or simply bad. It hands us human beings, shaped by the assumptions of their own time, capable of real virtue and real cruelty, often within the very same season of their lives. The Black Prince was, by any measure, one of the most feared knights Europe ever produced. But fear, as his own slowly failing body eventually proved, has its limits. No reputation, however fearsome, no armour, however dark, could hold back the quiet, patient progress of illness that finally caught up with him at 45 years old, in a palace far from any battlefield. If you have made it this far with me tonight, thank you for sharing these long hours with this story. Let the names and the battles begin to soften now. Crécy, Poitiers, Nájera, Limoges. Let them blur gently into the quiet of the room around you. Somewhere in Canterbury a bronze knight still lies with his hands folded in prayer, and somewhere in the dark behind your closed eyes, this long story of glory and sickness, courtesy and ruin, can finally be set down. Rest now.